Well, hello. Welcome to the Physionic podcast. Today we're going to be going over, as usual, a ton of different topics. I've got them all written down on my phone here. And I guess it's been 3 months or so since the last podcast. I've repeated this many times over that I very much appreciate this style as opposed to having the pressure of releasing an episode every week or every day or anything of that nature. But that said, with each episode, we do cover a ton of different topics. So what are the topics that we're going to be covering? We're going to be looking at how to think about aging. So I released an article in my Physionic community and on my email list on how to think about aging. If you're interested, it's completely free. You can join the email list or the Physionic community. Both of them will have access to it. Then we'll be covering oxidized LDL, which is a really interesting topic to me because it's not as clear-cut as I thought that the research was going to be. The next topic is going to be going over the TRIM study a little bit, so discussing that, so reversing aging. So I released a video on how this study proved that we could reverse aging. Oxalates causing cancer, creatine as a nootropic, niacin on heart disease, methylene blue, NMN on health, which I know is a hot button topic, inflammation and heart disease, eating to gain muscle, and then I've gathered a bunch of different comments from the subscribers, so from Physionic subscribers, and as well as questions under some of these topics. So, and then I'll be going over some housekeeping, specifically related to my video on sponsorships and as well as some updates in my own life if you're interested in that. Okay, so there's a lot to cover. This is going to be multi-hours of content of me talking. So as the running joke goes, if you are one of those people that turn on my videos to fall asleep, then you're welcome. But beyond that, yeah, we have a lot of content to go over. Sometimes people comment, well, why can't you just release a shortened version of this? This is a podcast. Welcome to what a podcast is. I always find that comical. I under every single podcast I've released, I've always gotten one or two comments that say, can't you just release this shorter? Why does it take so long for you to explain something? And I'm always incredulous because I always think to myself, like, it literally says on the title podcast. Have you never heard a podcast before? It's typically a person just talking, and it usually lasts longer. I don't know about you, but for me, I actually don't listen to podcasts that are 15 minutes long or short, or even 30 minutes. If a podcast isn't at least, for some reason in my head, if it's not at least 45 minutes, then I don't even listen to it because I don't know. It just doesn't resonate with me. I like depth. I like having long extended conversations. Anyway, but that aside from, my qualms about that aside, I'm going to have timestamps for you. So if you want to skip to a particular section, please feel free as usual. But if you're in for the long haul, if you're into fall asleep to my voice, then let's get into this. Well, as usual, I have my Jovio prototype mug right here. So I'll be taking coffee breaks along the way. The Jovio mug is if you're not familiar, it's my dad invented a mug that takes your piping hot drink, if that's tea, if that's coffee, whatever, and brings it down to drinkable temperature within a few minutes, and then maintains that temperature for hours, all through physics. It's pretty incredible. But that particular mug that I have is the prototype that I was gifted, I guess, a number of years ago. Yeah, it was a number of years ago, I think for my birthday or Christmas, one of those two. But I also bought one of the the ones that are actually on sale that are the finished product and whatnot. So if you're ever interested, check it out. But I mean, certainly don't. This isn't like a sponsored segment or anything like that. It's just my dad's small business. Okay, so how to think about aging. All right, so aging is a topic that people really, there's a lot of confusion related to it, that I think that people aren't even familiar with the fact that there is so much confusion related to it. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we think about aging, we typically think about, not always, but typically we think about it from the perspective of, I want to live the longest time possible. Another aspect of aging is, I want to live I wouldn't even call it the healthiest version of yourself. I would call it, although that is a major component, but I would also consider the functionality of your body. That is a critical component of aging. Now, both of those, the longest living and the functionality of your body, they are in parallel with one another for a long period of time, and then they diverge. And that's where that separation of the two is where people get really confused. And my current thought process, which seems to bear out in the literature, although as usual, and you always hear me say this, is that there are so many other studies that still need to release. So I'm basing this based off of the literature that's out there currently. And just the way that researchers talk about this topic in general, it's just, I've seen this area where there's a lot of parallel and then suddenly diverges. And of course it could create significant confusion. It creates confusion in my own head, and I do this for a living. So I can only imagine for a person who doesn't do this for a living, they would be incredibly confused. So one aspect of aging that we need to think about is health span. Health span is the functionality of your body, okay? And health span, with the best version of health span, you typically see an increase in lifespan, meaning that you see an extension in your life relative to if you didn't enact the different things that improve your health span. So there are different habits, different supplements, different nutrition styles that feed into an improved health span, and that also improves your lifespan. Okay, great. However, on the flip side, there's plenty of data, definitely in animals, but even some in humans, that indicates that certain habits that feed into health span actually take away from the maximum lifespan. Now, I just said it helps in lifespan, so what's going on here? That's where that confusion comes in. The way I think about it is that you can increase your average lifespan through an improvement in health span, but you cannot achieve, I should say, not improve, but achieve your maximum lifespan if you do some of the habits that go into health span. So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. When we think of health span, we think of doing exercise. We think of having a stable weight, so not gaining a bunch of weight, just staying within a range of what's an acceptable weight for your body type. We think of consuming particular nutrients in moderation, or, whatever nutrition style that you choose. But let's just go with like the bland, really what's been thrown out there over and over again, just making sure that you're eating vegetables, making sure that you're consuming fruits, that you're getting phytonutrients, that you're getting vitamins, that you're getting micronutrients. Obviously, vitamins are in there. Making sure that you're consuming sufficient protein, that you're consuming sufficient dietary fats. So a nice balanced nutrition. You can go to either extreme of that if you want. There are health benefits that could occur in both extremes as well. Let's say if you were to go to ketogenic, or if you were to go to more of like a vegan lifestyle, there are benefits there as well. I'll probably get a bunch of crap for saying that, but hands off, we're moving on, we're plowing on forward. So the point is that you have these different things that you've always known this. You've known this for, I can confidently say that you've known this for decades of time, that some of these things are just fundamental truths about our health. We've known this for the longest time. Now, the intricacies of what's a little bit more optimal and what's better in one category versus another category from person to person, that starts to get, you get really into the weeds, you get really into the details. And that's where science is currently trying to figure all that stuff out. But I think we can all agree that if you are overweight, you are less healthy than you would be if you were normal weight. I mean, I don't think I'm breaking any paradigm shifting ideas here. And exercise is obviously good for your health. Whatever form of exercise. Don't even think about, well, is it this one or is it? Just don't even worry about that. Just do the exercise of any sort. That it will be beneficial to your health. Now, so that's speaking to health span, because let's take exercise as an example. If you perform exercise for years of your life, then your entire physiology reacts to that continuously. It's constantly being exposed to this exercise stress, which ultimately leads to changes in your physiology, which progressively just hold off all the different detrimental aspects that come from, let's say, aging, like elevated oxidative stress or the deterioration of different cells or DNA mutation damage. I mean, all kinds of different things. So exercise helps fight those things off, and it improves your bone mass. It improves your muscle mass. It improves your muscle strength. It improves your neural activity. It improves your cognitive ability. Anything positive you can essentially just attribute, okay, exercise is associated to it. It is not even associated, but causes it. And we have hundreds and hundreds of studies proving that fact. So nobody really debates that. It's not like you're going to go, I mean, you might go on, hear some random wacko on social media, aside from this wacko right here, that will say exercise is detrimental to your health. It's like, if you hear that, I mean, I feel like just rub two brain cells together and you'll come to the conclusion of, okay, this guy is full of it. So it's that much of a universal truth, it seems like. Okay, so fair enough. That helps our health span. But what it also does is it extends our lifespan relative. So if you were to be in a parallel universe and you were to take a version of yourself that exercises, I'm just focusing on exercise, but we're talking about all the different health components. And then you were to take a person who doesn't exercise, the same person, it's you, alternate universe, and they were to run their lives parallel, exactly the same, except for this one thing is different. The exercising person is highly likely to live longer and to have the health span effect, as in they, let's say at the age of 65, they both hit 65 years of age. And one of them that didn't exercise has a hip problem where when they get out of a chair or get up from a sitting position, it takes them longer because they have this impingement and it really shoots down like a pain down their leg, for example, and they have a real hard time getting up from a chair. While the exercising individual, because they've been constantly putting their body through little bits of stress that ultimately leads the body to become much more robust, doesn't deal with that issue. That's a perfect example of health span. So at any given point in time, the person who's exercising, if they were to be compared against the same version of themselves without exercise, they would see an improvement, just an overall, they would just have a more functional life. Okay, so that's health span. But on the other hand, the other benefit is to lifespan. So the average lifespan would increase. So for the exercising individual, let's say the non-exercising individual would pass away at 72, and the exercising individual would pass away at 76. So there's two benefits. There's an extension of lifespan, but there's also the extension of up to that 76-year-old mark, they led a life where they could do more things in their life. Like they could, go for walks. They could, they had better cognitive clarity. I mean, it's just like a lot of different benefits. So hopefully you're seeing the point of that's the benefit of health span and lifespan. Okay. All right. So I don't want to belabor that too much, but that's an explanation of those two. Now, where do I come in here with saying, okay, but the other track of aging, or how we should reconsider aging, is that some people may want to, or the research in general, some of the research goes against what I just described. Okay. So I'll give you an example of that. Low protein diets are strongly associated with better longevity, as in longer life in animal models. Now, clearly the critique, of course, could be animal models don't necessarily follow the same as human models, but there are animal models that are closer to humans. We're not just talking about mice here. We're talking about monkeys as well. And we're talking about a bunch of other animal models as well. Dogs, there's a whole host of different animals that have been tested, and all of them see this effect. So the odds that it probably happens in humans, the similarity in DNA is one aspect, but the other aspect is we're mammals. I mean, it would be very difficult to make an argument that the line gets drawn immediately at humans. Humans are just this distinct thing that, biologically speaking, we are somehow so separate, even though our DNA is incredibly similar to a lot of these animals. There's just like a 1% difference. Anyway, I'll put that aside. So there's a lot of evidence in animals that, and there's some short-term evidence, but not any specific longevity evidence, because we can't do randomized controlled trials in humans that last 50 years, for example. Hey guys, we need you to consume really low protein, and this other group consumes really high protein for 50 years, and we want to see who dies first. And we would need to try to control as many other aspects as possible about your life for the next 50 years. You ready to sign up? It's not going to happen. So we have to base things off cohort studies. We have to base things off of associative studies, which are fine. That's how science works. We take all the evidence and try to make our best guesses off that evidence. Anyway, so we have some short-term studies that are randomized controlled trials that do show that if you reduce your protein intake, then you see lowering of these pro-growth hormone, these pro-growth hormones, which I'm more specifically talking about IGF-1. Now, I'm skeptical if we can just look at IGF-1 and say, oh, IGF-1 is the reason why people age faster. So therefore, if we lower IGF-1, then people will live longer. I'm not disputing it, but what I am disputing is that it would be the only mechanism. I find that highly unlikely. So, but let's focus on this one mechanism. So one mechanism that's been detailed is that IGF-1, if IGF-1 levels are high, then that tends to be a growth scenario for the body. And if that's the case, then it's also related to typically shorter lifespans. Okay, fair enough. So what we know from randomized controlled trials is if you drop your protein intake substantially, then you will reduce your IGF-1 levels. Fine. But then on the health span perspective, if you're exercising, especially if you're resistance training, it necessitates that you consume more protein. How do we balance those two? How can those two are in conflict with one another, but they both extend lifespan? Ah, yes. Well, that is where they extend lifespan together in parallel for a while, and then they separate, where the one where you are reducing your protein intake for long periods of time ultimately leads to, the idea is that it would lead to an extension of your life that would be more in line with a maximum lifespan extension. So when your body is born, the idea, one of the predominant theories, and I won't go into it. One of the predominant theories is called the soma theory of aging, where you have a certain amount of growth that can occur in your body, and then you exhaust essentially everything in your body because your body's just trying to get to a point where it procreates, and then everything after that is essentially just, you're lucky to survive it. So that's a really simplistic understanding of the soma theory of aging. I need to read into it more, but it has some basis in evolution and all this other stuff, which is fine. My big gripe with these kinds of things is that people throw these theories around without like actually offering data, hard data. That's all I care about. I just want hard data. I don't really care that much about what some hypothesis or some theory brings about if there isn't like hard data, which I'm sure it has some hard data behind it, but I need to look into it further. The point is that you have this theory, and if we were to follow that, if that is the idea, then if you have constant replication that's occurring in the health span situation, that's great, because I mean you're keeping yourself strong and healthy, and you're able to then extend your lifespan relative. Again, the key point here is relative to if you weren't doing any of those things. So the worst possible scenario is if you don't do anything health related, then you will shorten your life. Then you will essentially, let's think of it like a minimum lifespan and a minimum health span. You will be at the bottom rung of what you could have been. You didn't reach your potential. But once you started to employ a lot of these exercise things, if you're listening to this podcast, that's probably you. You are one of these people trying to improve your health and relying on some wacko on the internet to help you. Then in that scenario, then you are moving yourself away from the minimum lifespan and moving yourself into pushing your lifespan further on and pushing your health span further on. But then there's this other group of people that choose to potentially go, and there's like, for example, one group of people is the Calorie Restriction Society. Like there's an actual society that believes in like reducing your calories perpetually for your life. And so there are people that do this, but there's also just the general research and whatnot. So ultimately indicating that if you lower your protein intake, lower your caloric intake, then you can extend that life. So if you take the what you would reach if you went the health span route, you would push that even further with this other way of doing things. The idea behind that is simply that you're trying to do some of the things that you would do for health span. So you would still try to exercise. You would still try to do like some of the basic things, but there are limitations. Like you can't recover from exercise nearly as well if you're constantly calorically restricted and you're constantly restricting your protein. So that's where you start to have that divergence between the two. And this version, the version that is more lifespan oriented and not as concerned with health span, tends to, at least my understanding currently, is pushes the limit of your body because it slows the growth of your body. It actually slows the growth of your body through one mechanism, is through IGF-1. You reduce IGF-1 significantly, you do that perpetually for long periods of time. the growth of your body slows down, which extends the overall life of your body. There's a lot of other mechanisms that occur within your body that also feed into this whole idea. So that's where you get this separation, and that's where I think people get really confused, because they say, well, on one hand, I should be exercising, I should be eating this, I should be eating that. On the other hand, there's research saying, well, I need to be calorically restricting all the time. I need to be consuming super low levels of protein and whatnot. And that's because, again, in my estimations, there's two different approaches to this. And I also think that if you're going to go the more, what I consider the more extreme route, which is pushing for that extra lifespan extension, trying to push for the maximum lifespan, then those individuals typically have to have some burden on their health span. So they're trading in some of the health span for the lifespan extension effects. So will you be able to achieve maximum functionality? Like, could you go for a walk? Yes, of course you can go for a walk. But can you squat and deadlift and pull up and all these different exercises that would help you, or go running, let's say 5 times a week, or, for 45 minutes or an hour or whatever, just to go jogging? That's where your body's starting, especially as you get older and older and as your protein requirements increase, that starts to take a hit. Like, you're going to hit a wall where your body simply can't physiologically handle repairing and recovering from all these things, and still you maintaining this caloric deficit. And that's a big reason why, if you are in a caloric deficit, energy deficit, and you are losing weight, but you're also trying to hold on to your muscle, like you go to the gym a lot, your performance typically suffers after a point. And for the exact same reasons, your body simply can't keep up with the maintenance and the growth that's necessary. So, because the resources simply aren't there, you're not feeding your body the resources. So I just wanted to offer that explanation. I'm not saying that I know all the answers. I'm not saying that this is definitive, this is the new Nick's theory of aging or anything like that. I'm not at all saying that. But it's the way that I frame things, and it makes a lot of sense, especially, as we get into talking about like rapamycin and metformin and all these different drugs. Like, they help with this more longevity aspect, but they don't typically help that much with health span, because health span is a lot more about habits and big picture things that you're doing that then extend your overall lifespan as well, like relative to what you would be if you didn't do any of that stuff. So Janet actually talked about this in the Physionic community. She's a Physionic insider as well, and she said, I've actually been wondering about this because I read and looked at diet research. She's talking about me. You're researching other things so often, because I bounce from topic to topic because I don't want to focus on just one thing. And it always seems contradictory to what she's read. But I thought I was probably just not understanding. So this is incredibly helpful. This is an explanation that I just offered, which maybe I bounced around too much, but is incredibly helpful and disconcerting at the same time, which I understand. Yeah, I mean, of course, that there are choices that you have to make in your life, and those choices will affect how your health trajectory and your longevity trajectory are going to go. And that's why it's critically important to be engaging with people that read research and distill that research appropriately. They will make mistakes. I will make mistakes, for example. I know I will make mistakes, but I always try to add amendments to all my content. And if it's a really big one, I'll take the video down, or I'll take the content down. Or if it's a really big one, I'll also make an announcement so that people know that I've taken some video down or made some sort of major amendment, mainly because, it's about transparency. That's the idea. But there are other people out there that put out great content. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of Peter Attia. I haven't watched enough of his content to be like, I don't watch his content every day or anything like that. But every once in a while, I stumble across some of his stuff. I think so far, everything I've seen from him has been really fantastic. We may or may not disagree on like small stuff here and there. I don't know. But overall, I think his content is really fantastic. And there's other examples out there as well that are focused on different realms of health. And it's really important to, and what the beautiful thing about social media is that we do have access to those people. The negative, of course, is now you also have access to the people that are just straight up charlatans. And it's confusing then to try to decipher, okay, then the next question you have to ask yourself is like, well, how do I decipher between, this group and this group, and how do you, and then even within a group of researchers have established like people that put out good content on a regular basis, they may disagree a little bit, but typically that disagreement is pretty low grade. It's like, well, I think I would interpret this data this way, and this person would interpret it that way. But you're still looking at the same data, and usually that interpretation is a really mild difference between the two. So sticking anywhere within that range of mild disagreement this way, mild disagreement that way, you're probably pretty good. You don't need to worry about it that much to the point where it's like, I have to figure out who's right because I have to extend my lifespan maximally, or I have to extend my health span maximally. Just as long as you're following the right people and you're getting good information from those individuals, even if they slightly disagree every once in a while, I think you're in the best possible position. And that is a beautiful thing about social media. So, but also the other aspect of this is you have to hit the ground running as early as possible. Think of it like, I sometimes use this analogy, but kind of think about like compound interest. If you are compounding in general, I guess we're talking about like an index fund or some sort of retirement account or whatever you want to talk about, it increases slowly, and it has this net effect that continues to build and build and build up until, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, it's created this massive gap between where you are and where you could have been. And that is a really remarkable thing. And it's, if you can get that in your head and be following the right people, that's what you're creating for yourself. You're creating this compounding health effect. So even if a few recommendations change a little bit here and there, overall, you are far better than what you were, right? Than what you would have been if you hadn't done anything. So yes, it's disconcerting, but hopefully more helpful than disconcerting. Janet, thanks for your comment. Okay, I'm going to leave the rest of the comments for later, but I just wanted to quick touch on that one. So how to think about aging. I hope that offered some level of clarity, and now I'm going to have a coffee break. All right, well, as I promised, this is going to be an incredibly lengthy episode. So the next topic is to discuss oxidized LDL. Whew, all right. I discussed LDL, or low-density lipoproteins, which are these vessels that contain cholesterol molecules and triglyceride molecules inside of them, and they transport them throughout the body. So I guess I'll quick describe that. I'm not going to go into the research on LDL itself because I covered that in the last podcast, and I've covered that on other content as well. I don't really want to repeat myself. But for anybody that's new, just to understand the physiology a little bit, when you have the delivery of, or the production of cholesterol and the delivery of triglycerides, which are fat molecules inside your liver, then that gets repackaged. The liver cells will produce this ball, which is kind of a protein coating on the outside, or has proteins on the outside. And then it will stuff this ball with the triglyceride molecules and the cholesterol molecules. And then it will throw those or kick those out, export those balls with the cholesterol molecules and the triglycerides inside them out of the liver. And now it's called a very low density lipoprotein, VLDL. Then from there, it interacts with all the different tissues of your body. And as it interacts, it loses the components inside of itself. It loses the cholesterol and the triglycerides. And as that happens, it shrinks. Because if you were to stuff something full of something and then you start removing stuff, it's going to shrink. Simple as that. And it shrinks into an LDL molecule, or a low density. So it goes from very low density to low density. So it's smaller, and then that continues to circulate. I mean, technically it goes through an IDL phase, which is an intermediate density lipoprotein, and then it goes to LDL. But that's the general idea of this LDL. So it serves a function in our body. Again, I'm not going to go into all the arguments against the LDL and the effect on heart disease. People throw a lot of, I'll be honest with you, a lot of nonsensical arguments against the whole idea, but I'm not going to go into it. But one of the reasons why people talk about oxidized LDL specifically is that oxidized LDL is highly associated with heart disease risk. So the idea being that if you have this high LDL that's found in your bloodstream, the LDL crosses, so you've got a blood vessel. That blood vessel is like a tube. Let's just look at it like a tube. So the very intersection of the tube, the opening area is called the lumen, and that's where the LDL is floating through. Think of like a hose, for example. So the water flowing through is the blood, and then within that blood you would have a bunch of these LDL particles transporting the cholesterol molecules and the triglyceride molecules. And then from there, you have these LDL particles that will then move from the lumen and into the wall of the tube, into the wall of the hose, into the wall of the blood vessel. And that first layer of the wall is endothelial cells, a single layer of endothelial cells, which are a type of cell that regulate your blood vessel. We don't need to get into that. So this particle crosses past the endothelial layer, and it can do that through a number of different mechanisms. It is not specific to injury. Injury does not need to occur to the endothelial layer for this crossing of the LDL particles past the first layer of the wall, and will then bind to these proteins that make up one of the proteins, or a few of the proteins that make up the structure of the rest of the wall. So there's the endothelial layer, then there's these protein structures that give the actual structure to the wall. Think of it like the plastic that gives the structure to the hose. And when these LDL particles attach, then they can get stuck there for a while. And when they get stuck there for a while, they can undergo an oxidation phase, which means that there's essentially damage that occurs to the LDL particle. This LDL particle then, because it's been oxidized and because it's been damaged, leads to the recruitment of immune cells. I'm going to go into this a little bit more later on when we go into the inflammation and the effect on heart disease. So let's just leave it there, that you have this oxidation of the LDL. This leads to a recruitment of the immune cells, and then you have a cascade of atherogenesis that occurs after that. But I'm going to go into that a little bit later on. The point being that you have this association of these oxidized LDL that build up behind the wall, and then that leads to a growth of the wall. So instead of having a nice thin lumen, a nice thin opening that the blood can just keep squeezing through, you have this pocket that starts to build, and now the lumen becomes smaller and smaller because you go from 100% space to now 80% space, 40% space, so on and so forth, until you have essentially an occlusion where the blood flow is very thin and can barely get through. Now that creates a lot of pressure in that region. And as a result, then you can have the plaque break off and thrombosis occur, where you have like a ball of this like platelets and a bunch of different other factors and cholesterol and all that stuff that floats down, and it's much bigger. So it as the hose shrinks, because you get into the finer areas of your body, let's say your legs, like peripheral artery disease, your brain, like stroke, it'll get lodged in those smaller vessels and cause, let's say, a stroke or peripheral artery disease. So that's a overview of what happens. But the point being that oxidized LDL is related to this concept because it's kind of at the beginning stages of this atherogenesis. So the idea being that if a lot of people have said that oxidized LDL are the reason why we see this atherogenesis occur. And I looked at a number of studies on this, 5 or 6 studies, some meta-analyses, a lot of stuff. And there is that association. It is true that there is that association. And it seems more likely than not that the oxidation process is a causative factor for heart disease risk or cardiovascular disease risk as a whole, because it seems to be one of the triggers for this beginning of this whole process. Okay, so fair enough. What I've had difficulty teasing out is if it must occur for heart disease progression to occur. And there are 2 ways to try to figure this out, or at least 2 ways that I've tried to figure this out. One of them is you can look at the different sizes of LDL particles. So small, dense LDL particles are more prone to being oxidized. And large, buoyant LDL particles are not as prone to be oxidized. So a lot of the arguments that have been put forward is that if you have large, buoyant LDL, then it isn't a risk factor because it can't be oxidized. But notice right there, if I were to say just those 2 sentences of large, buoyant LDL is less likely to be oxidized, and then I followed that up with, so therefore the argument is that people with large, buoyant LDL do not have heart disease risk. That sentence alone, to a researcher, somebody who's listening, who knows about the topic, would put up their hand and be like, hold up. That is a mistake right there. You've said words in a particular order that are technically correct, but they need to be reframed. Let me try to explain this a little bit better. I'm doing a poor job. So this is what I'm talking about when people seem like they know what they're talking about, yet they don't show data they don't show large amounts of data to prove that what they are saying is actually true. Because that was a recharacterization. My point being with those 2 sentences is that the first sentence was correct. The second sentence was not correct. The reason why the second sentence was not correct is because it reframed the first sentence. I said that these large buoyant LDL are less likely to be oxidized. And the next sentence was then, therefore, large buoyant LDL are not a risk factor. That is not the case. That is not what the data currently shows. The reason for that is because just because they're less likely to be oxidized does not mean that they are not oxidized. And that is something, that is a reframe that so many people have done on the internet of just saying, well, large buoyant LDL are not a concern because they don't get oxidized. That is not correct. Large buoyant LDL do get oxidized, just less than small dense LDL. So your risk is still present with large buoyant LDL. But don't get me wrong, this is not based on just mechanisms. We don't have to just look at mechanisms to say, oh, well, this is why large buoyant LDL are still a risk factor. We can just look at data, which I presented in my full study analysis on the topic, where if you were to look at large buoyant LDL, the answer is yes, there's still a risk factor. With people that have high levels of large buoyant LDL, even they still have this risk of heart disease risk. Now, the one area that I will admit that I haven't seen enough evidence, and I cannot seem to find any person that I trust as well as data to back up what they say. I need both of those. I can't just say, well, this person said. Like if the top cardiologist in the world says something, that's great. I mean, I'm thankful. I'm like, whoa, okay, great. I can pay attention to this person, but I also need to see the evidence. I need to see the data because it's just the way my brain works. I have to actually see it so that I can integrate it into how I think about things. And I have not run across anyone yet that has actually provided me with significant proof of this one factor. That factor is that I don't know if small dense LDL are more dangerous than large buoyant LDL. It seems like there's a potential that there is a slightly increased risk. I don't even know if it's slightly increased. I wonder if it is much more of a risk, or if it's just a slight increased risk, or if they're about equivalent. I don't know that, but what I do know is that large buoyant LDL are a risk factor. Just point blank. Now, the quantification of how small dense LDL are relative to large buoyant LDL, that's where I'm getting into this realm that I haven't seen enough evidence to really convince me one way or another. But so, and the idea being that so many people have said that small dense LDL are more of a risk factor, or are the only risk factor, which is the wrong reframe of the evidence, because they become oxidized. Again, just to repeat one more time, large buoyant do get oxidized, just less than small dense. Okay, so that's one way to look at this problem and see if, well, are people that have more of this large buoyant LDL, do they still have risk of heart disease? And the answer is yes, but they may have less of a risk compared to small dense LDL. So the takeaway here is that you should lower your LDL. You should lower your ApoB levels, more specifically, because LDL is weakly associated with heart disease risk. And people then, before I finish off this loop of the second part, people then hear, well, there's a weak association. They think that then LDL isn't that much of a factor. That's not how to interpret the research. That's not what a weak association means. It means that LDL is still a factor. It's just not the only factor. And I've said this many, many times now. LDL is not the only factor for heart disease risk. And ApoB is a better measure because it specifically looks at LDL, VLDL, IDL. It looks at all the different ApoB-containing lipoproteins, which are the ones that actually get stuck in the wall that I described earlier. So ApoB is a better marker, and it tends to associate better with heart disease risk than LDL. So that's why I say it's a weak association. But I've been focused on LDL because LDL is the biggest, one of the bigger players when it comes to ApoB. Okay, so just to clear that. Okay, the second aspect is we can attack this from the second perspective, is not just by separating it based off of small LDL and large LDL, but we can look at it from the perspective of oxidation levels. And there's some evidence that I've seen that even in non-oxidized LDL, when you separate out the non-oxidized LDL from the oxidized LDL, there are associations that the non-oxidized LDL still cause heart disease risk. Again, here, I don't know if it causes more or less. I'm going to guess less of a risk, but it is still a risk. Now, why might that be? Well, people attribute this one mechanism of oxidation of LDL as the only way that LDL can be dangerous. That is not the case. The reason for that is because, let's take, for example, the large buoyant LDL, which are less likely to be oxidized. They also contain more cholesterol within them, the cholesterol molecules. And when they get phagocytosed, when they get taken over by an immune cell, when they get sucked up by an immune cell, which means that the immune cell will infiltrate into that region. Again, I'm going to go into more detail on this a little bit later on. And it will gobble up, that's the very technical term, gobble up this LDL. And then from there, it can be broken up. So the actual capsule, the vessel that I described earlier with the protein and all that stuff that contains the actual cholesterol, the lipoprotein itself, that can get destroyed. And then the cholesterol within can actually aggregate together. And you can also find this with the lipoproteins themselves. The lipoproteins can aggregate together so that you get these, when you're talking about the cholesterol molecule itself, you're talking about cholesterol crystals that form. These cholesterol crystals can be pro-inflammatory. I'm not going to go into the cellular mechanisms. You get the activation of NF-kappa B and the inflammasome, and there's a bunch of other stuff, but I'm not going to go into it. I very much want to, but this is already going to be like 2 or 3 hours, and we're already almost an hour into this. So, and I have a lot of other stuff to get into. So the point is that you have these cholesterol crystals that form, or that get essentially, quote unquote, stuck within the immune cell, and you get the inflammation response from that within the immune cell. Now, on the other end, you also have the actual lipoproteins that can aggregate together as well, which can also lead to an inflammation response. Now, both of those can occur independent of oxidation, and they occur more frequently with the large buoyant LDL. Where have you heard this before? Probably never, because again, the focus has been so much on small dense LDL being the only risk factor, but this is what I'm talking about. It's utter BS, because there is evidence that shows, no, that's not the case. There is some evidence that large buoyant are also a problem. And some of the pushback that sometimes is offered is that evidence comes from studies that are in people with hypercholesterolemia, which is people that have a genetic disposition to have really high levels of LDL, or the low density lipoprotein. And the answer is, again, no, that's not the case. The evidence is not squarely based on just this subset of people. The evidence is actually based on general population studies as well. So I think it's a mischaracterization. It's essentially a straw man to say, well, the evidence is only based on those studies, and that's not true. There's evidence outside of those studies as well as those studies. So, and I won't go into more of the critiques on that. Again, that's another rabbit hole. So Yeah, there's evidence. So we've looked at it from the point of view of trying to separate out large buoyant and small dense. Both are a risk factor. Exactly how much, that's the difficult part that I can't figure out yet. Then looking at oxidized versus non-oxidized. So not looking at the size of the particles, just looking at oxidized versus non-oxidized, there's still a risk factor. So my conclusion up to this point has been that that oxidized LDL are absolutely a risk factor, but they are not the only risk factor. And I go into more detail with the Physionic Insiders. I go into, in my video on oxidized LDL, my study analysis, I go into other forms, other like tests and other risk factors that come with oxidized LDL and non-oxidized LDL. So if you're interested in that, join the Physionic Insiders. Anyway, but the point is that the big picture is that's why focusing on just oxidized LDL is an incomplete version of looking at your heart disease risk from a lipoprotein standpoint. It is far more appropriate to look at your overall LDL burden, and that will be the best way, or overall ApoB burden would be the best way to look at your heart disease risk from a lipoprotein point of view. One more thing I'll say on this is that people then say, well, I'll just lower my oxidation, which I've already attacked that from another perspective, but you can never lower your oxidation to zero. So at all points, think about it. There's just a reasonable argument here, but this also bears out in the literature. If you lower your oxidation rate to nothing, let's just go with the premise, even though this is incorrect, just to be 100% clear here, this is incorrect to say that oxidized LDL is the only risk factor, but let's just run with it just for a second. If that's the case, then rationally you'd be thinking, all right, well, I'm just going to drop my oxidation levels. I'm going to bring it to zero. And therefore, all the LDL is never going to be oxidized. And therefore, I'll never have any issues, right? The problem is you will never reach zero oxidation. That does not happen. That will never happen. You have to have a certain level of oxidation. Oxidation is not necessarily just a bad thing. It serves a function within the body. It just so happens that over-oxidation or oxidative stress, which also happens, still occurs no matter what. Like even if you're the healthiest human being on planet Earth, you are Brian Johnson, there is still some level of oxidation happening within the body, and therefore you will be always oxidizing some LDL. So one thing that you could do, if you have a huge population of LDL and you have a little bit of oxidation occurring, you're going to be interacting and more prone to oxidizing that large body of LDL. Or you could lower your oxidation levels, fine, but you could also lower your LDL levels, and therefore you have less chance of interaction between the two. Just throwing that out there. So, but again, just to reiterate one last time, then I'm going to move on. Oxidation rates are not the only factor when it comes to the ApoB or LDL risk factors. Okay, the next topic. Hold on, coffee break. Okay, next topic. The TRIM study for reversing aging. This was brought to my attention by a Physionic Insider. Maybe you're seeing a trend here. I tend to take a lot of suggestions from the insiders because I have to pay most of my attention there. So this is from James Haas. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correct. I've never actually asked you how you pronounce your last name, James. But anyway, he had mentioned this TRIM study for reversing aging, which was a study that came out in 2016, I think. And they're actually doing another study based on what they found from this first study. So anyway, it was a small sample of men, like 12 or something, or 10, something like that, really small. So that's certainly a critique of the study. But it was more of a pilot study than anything. And they wanted to know what would happen if they exposed these men to a cocktail of molecules. That cocktail of molecules was human growth hormone, metformin, DHEA, vitamin D, and zinc. And I'm going to address each one of these individually as well, because I received a lot of questions related to that on the video, and I can't answer all the comments. I get just thousands of comments now, which I'm thankful for. I just can't respond to it again. I have to put most of my attention toward the Physionic insiders. So the idea was that these people would be given this cocktail of molecules, and then from there, over months, they had I shouldn't say many, but several different metrics of health measured. So they looked at the thymus, which is a section inside, like upper part of your body, near the top of your chest, that it's responsible for the maturation of your T cells, which is part of your adaptive immune system. And that goes through a process called thymic involution, where it goes from a lean tissue, so a tissue that is active and actually serves a function, the function I just talked about, and then it becomes fattier, and it becomes filled with fat until it literally is just a glob of fat. And that happens throughout our lifetime, but it really speeds up super quickly within just a few years when we hit our 60s. So when we hit our 60s, thymic involution just speeds up massively, and then the whole thing just turns to fat, and essentially just kind of eliminates that function of our body, of our adaptive immune system. So you can imagine that it would be incredible if we could reverse that process, right? And that's what they found. I'll just go ahead and cut to the chase, which is an expression I've never understood. So yeah, they gave these people the cocktail, and they found that the thymus went from fat tissue back to lean tissue. I can't express to you the level of physiological involvement, the amount of turnover that has to happen inside your body to go from one tissue to another tissue is remarkable. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of cells that have to then turn back from one type of tissue, have to go back into what's known as stemness, which means a whole genetic reprogramming of these cells, have to go back into stemness, then from the stem cells have to then reprogram themselves back into the thymic tissues. Mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. So I thought that was the coolest thing. That's probably one of the coolest things that I've read. Now I'll go ahead and say it. It's the coolest thing I've read all year. For this year up to now. Maybe in December I'll read something else and I did read some other cool stuff as well, a lot of really cool stuff, but I'll leave that for another time. So anyway, the thymic involution was reversed in these individuals, and which was really cool. So that was one aspect. So it literally, I mean that quite literally, reversed their aging of their thymus. Sweet. Second thing that was discussed is they also looked at these epigenetic clocks. I'm going to talk about this more when we get to the NMN section, but the epigenetic clocks are a comparison of your genome, the way that your genes are being expressed, versus your biological age. So, versus your chronological age, excuse me. So your biological age versus your chronological age. Your chronological age is just, I am 67 years old, or I am 45 years old. It's just the number of like life years that you've experienced. And the biological age is being measured by the epigenome. So the epigenetic tags, there are these different, you have your genes, and which is your genome, and then you have these tags that are applied to your genes to essentially either repress the genes so that they are not read and then produce the proteins that are made from those genes, or they can be expressed or be more readily available for their expression, which means that those genes are then read more frequently to produce the proteins that they encode. Okay, so that was the idea, to look at the epigenome, because then you can relate. Okay, if you have a data, let's say you look at the epigenome of 10,000 people. Okay, you have, let's say, 2,000 people that are in their 20s, 2,000 people that are in their 30s, 2,000, 40s, 50s, 60s. Let's just go with that. Then you can relate the information. You have all this data from 2,000 people in each group. You say, these people are in their 20s. We've got 2,000 people. We've read their epigenome. We can map this out, what their epigenome looks like, where the tags are placed on their genome. And then we can relate, okay, if you're 20 years old, this is what your epigenome on average would look like. Then from here, we can go to a 50-year-old, and all the 50-year-olds, the 2,000 people that were in the 50s, have an average genome. And then we can cross-reference how different are they from one another. So that will then give you an indication of which genome corresponds more to 50-year-olds, which genome corresponds more to 20-year-olds. And that's the idea of the epigenetic clocks. I mean, there's a lot more details to it than I've even explained, and maybe I'll make some content on exactly how it works, because it's something I need to look into in more depth as well. Okay, so then you can look at, let's say you're 35 years old and you do an epigenetic test and you end up at 25 years old. Like, it tells you your epigenome is at 25 years old. So your cells are essentially reading and expressing genes, or have the potential to read and express genes at the age of a 25-year-old. That's pretty cool information, right? I mean, I think that's really cool information. Is it the end-all, be-all of aging? Is it like this is the only test we should look at? No, it's not. Just to be clear, it's not. But is it really cool? Is it really informative? I think it's informative, and yes, it is even cooler. But so anyway, so this study looked at a number of different epigenetic clocks, or these tests. They looked at the Grimm age, they looked at the Horvath clock, and they looked at like maybe two others, I think, as well. And why they have these different versions is because they come from different data sets of people. They're very similar to one another, but they may have some slight distinctions from one another. And some are a little bit more accurate than others, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, they used 4 of them, just to be 100% clear, after testing these people's epigenome, and they found that their epigenome got younger up to, I want to say like 6 months, 6 months, I want to say. Don't quote me on that. I'm 80% certain, but 6 months. And then, but it only marginally, just got a little bit younger, just a little bit, maybe like a year or 6 months younger, which isn't, I mean, I wouldn't be like, okay, all right, whatever. But then the final 3 months of the study, there was this sudden massive drop in their age, where they dropped over 6 years in 3 months. It was almost like the effect needed time to really, really take effect. And they saw this, I think the average was 6.5 year drop in age from the start to the end of the study, which was the whole study was, I think, 9 months, but then they had another 3-month follow-up afterwards, if I remember correctly. But it's somewhere in that range, so it doesn't matter if you tack on another 3 months or lose another 3 months, who cares? So that was really incredible. And that got me pretty excited, because now you're talking about this like cocktail of molecules, just molecules. They're changing nothing else. And they're seeing this an actual reversal of age that's physical. They could feel it. They could actually see it in their thymus, but they could also see it in the epigenome. Additionally, what I noticed, and I can't corroborate this, I haven't done any statistics or anything like this on there, but they saw improvements in like their GFR, like glomerular filtration rate, which is a measure of kidney function, and a few other measures as well. And those actually improved significantly right at that point, right at the 6 to 9 month area where they saw the sudden drop in epigenetic age. So I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if those are related to one another. That would be really cool to investigate. Okay, so now two more things I'll say on this topic. One is one of the critique that I saw multiple times in the comment section, which is 100% fair, is why didn't they include women? And look, I don't have a defense. I'm with you. I agree. Like, it'd be great if they had added women. I will say that there is good news on that front, because the next study, from what I remember, which is called the TRIM-X study, if you want to look it up, which is finishing at the end, I want to say the end of next year, maybe the year, I think it's the end of next year, so 2024. And they did include women in that study. So we're going to see and hopefully they have enough sample size so that they can actually figure out if there are differences based off of sex. That would be super interesting. If you maybe see greater effects in women or worse effects in women versus men. And then, of course, have a combination where you could, bolster statistics even further rather than just looking at 10 individuals, 10 men in this study. So I hear you. I'm with you. I wish they had added women. One of the complexities with women, though, admittedly, not the fault of women by any means, but one of the complexities when it comes to science is that you have to then account for the menstrual cycle, which a lot of researchers do a decent job. Some researchers do a pretty horrible job of it, which is unfortunate when I'm reading studies that include women and then they don't actually account for the menstrual cycle. It kind of blows my mind. But a lot of the research that I've read, they always have like a few sentences in there where they describe, okay, we measured at this specific time in the month, every single time. We standardized things based off of each woman. We figured out their menstrual cycle. We had conversations with them, made sure that we only measured during, I think it's usually during like the follicular phase, I want to say, probably like mid-follicular phase, I would say. And then sometimes they'll do it in the luteal phase, kind of after the ovulation. So it is usually standardized, but I'm assuming that because this was also very expensive. I mean, think about the amount of HGH, metformin, and all that stuff that they have to pay for. So I'm just throwing an answer out there as to why they potentially excluded women, is because they wanted to make sure that there would be an effect, and now they can do it in women as well. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, the second thing that I wanted to discuss now, the actual stack itself. So HGH, metformin, DHEA, vitamin D, zinc. All right. So a lot of people were saying, well, why did they add DHEA? Like, nobody can buy DHEA, or nobody can buy HGH, or whatever it is. Like, you can get, as far as I know, you can get HGH. It would have to be through a doctor. But the others, obviously vitamin D is available, zinc is available, but the other two, metformin, DHEA, were not present for the anti-aging effects, to be clear. I probably should have mentioned this in the video, but they weren't present for the anti-aging effects. They were there to mitigate some of the negative effects of HGH. HGH is a powerful hormone. It's not something you just inject in your body and you're like, all right, I'm straight. It has negative repercussions as well. Like, it could increase IGF-1 levels, for example, which we talked about earlier. And to mitigate some of that, so to mitigate some of the IGF-1 effects and the insulin effects, they had added DHEA to lower the insulin effect. So that was the reason why they added DHEA. The other one is metformin to preserve insulin sensitivity. So they were attacking things from both sides of the coin. They were trying to make sure that the insulin or IGF-1 levels weren't going to be heightened too much, and then, which is on one side of the equation, and then the other side of the equation, they wanted to make sure that the sensitivity to insulin and IGF-1 and all that would still be high, so that they could have these lower levels and still have the sensitivity, because you don't want these people to suddenly become blood sugar intolerant or insulin resistant or whatever because they're injecting HGH. So it was finely tuned, and they took weeks where they finely tuned it to each individual to make sure that the amounts were appropriate for that individual. They took multiple blood measures and made sure to kind of stack things slowly. And vitamin D and zinc were just in addition to that. So the main effect for sure is due to HGH, but if you were to just take HGH, I think that you may not experience these benefits, these effects. You would probably have to do it exactly how they do it in the study. So we'll see what happens in the future with the TRIM-X study. I'm looking forward to it, and obviously I'll be reporting on it once that releases. Okay, next topic. But first, coffee. All right, the next topic is oxalates causing cancer. So this was another one that was brought up by Physionic Insider. They wanted to know about oxalates in general. And I had the hardest time trying to find studies that looked at oxalates. I'd heard from many people that oxalates are linked to cancer, and I was like, where is this coming from? And I looked up studies for it. I had the hardest time finding them. I finally found one, or I guess I found two, but this study, the main study that I focused on, was looking at BALB-C nude mice. And that may be just a jumbled mess to you. You may not even understand what I'm talking about there, which is fair. So what the researchers did is that they injected oxalates. They literally injected oxalates into the breast tissue of BALB-C nude mice. And what they found is that the oxalates caused breast cancer. What was interesting is that when they injected it in other areas of the body, the oxalates did not cause cancer. They only caused cancer when they were injected specifically in the breast tissue. Now, one of the questions that might be coming my way is, well, maybe it was just the injection, like the injecting straight into the breast tissue may cause like some sort of inflammatory response or something like that, that it's not necessarily the oxalates. Well, they did or the perturbation of that area may lead to, growth as it's recovering and therefore lead to cancer. I don't know. I'm just throwing something out there. They did vehicle injections where they did the exact same injection, the exact same site, just without oxalates, and they did not find this effect. So it is specifically oxalates that cause this problem. They also looked at tissue in humans. So it wasn't straight up all in mice. They also looked at human tissue of women with breast cancer, took tissue and found that the oxalate levels were much higher in that tissue compared to the same women, the other side, the other breast that did not have cancer. They took samples and they found the oxalate levels were much higher in the women breast tissue that was that had cancer. So that created this association, and that's why they were looking at in these mice what would happen if you injected oxalates. So actually try to use a causative effect, because again, that's just an association between the women. However, when looking at the mice, it was straight up inject oxalates, cause cancer, done. And the mice died very soon afterwards because they suddenly started having rampant cancer all over the place. Okay, so that was, certainly on the face of it seems kind of concerning, because even though it's in mice, which is always kind of remarkable, people are like, well, we can't translate mice research to humans, but then when it's something that's scary or whatever, suddenly we're like, oxalates. Oh my God. So what I ended up doing is I broke this study down, and in reality, there are a lot of problems with this study. And so I don't know if people that have talked about oxalates causing cancer, if that was really based on what I thought was good science. So I'm not saying the science of the actual study itself was poorly designed. It was fine, but it was just hyper specific, and it really had no applicability, mainly because not because we're talking about mice, but because we're talking about these types of mice. That's why I mentioned BALB/C nude mice. If you're in molecular biology, cell biology, physiology, in that realm, and you work with BALB/C nude mice, I did not know this. I had to look this up. But when you look it up, you find that these are immunocompromised mice. So they don't have an immune system, or they have a very weak immune system. So the answer is yes, oxalates cause cancer, but only in a very specific site with high levels of oxalates exposure. And on top of that, they didn't have an immune system, and it was in mice. So that's a lot of different layers there. And I love some of the comments, which were snarky, but very apt. We've completely agreed, saying that, if I remember correctly, yes, I love injecting oxalates into my breast tissue, which I hear you. That's, there's no applicability there either. Nobody's going to do that. But the big picture was just that the exposure of oxalates. So unfortunately, I just don't think that study is convincing of anything. Oh, one more thing, actually, as a matter of fact, they then did the same experiment in BALB mice, I think just BALB mice, which are essentially very similar to BALB/C nude mice, but they're not nude, so they're wearing clothes. Okay, I'll stop. They have fur, but they also have an immune system, and they did the exact same experiments, and they found no cancer, 0 traces of cancer, doing the exact same thing. So that would implicate that now, let's say we remove the immunodeficiency standpoint. Now we're talking about oxalates not causing cancer. So you can see this hyper specificity of this study that was focused on these BALB/C nude mice. It just doesn't have any application. Even within mice, it doesn't have any application, much less to do with humans. So I was like, this is nonsense. Here's the data, the data obviously shows. And clearly there's still this association. So let me address that. The association in human tissue, right, where you have high levels of oxalates. The problem is we don't know if people were exposed to oxalates and that's what caused the cancer, or, which I find probably more likely, and we do have evidence for this, that the cancer cells take up oxalates, or that they produce large amounts of oxalates, which is another component. We produce oxalates. Our body produces oxalates during its metabolism as a whole, through a few different mechanisms. So when you don't consume oxalates, about 50% of your, I should reframe that. When you don't consume much of oxalate consuming food, so you're kind of a low oxalate consuming a person, about 50% of the oxalates in your body are produced by your own body. And then if you consume high amounts of oxalate consuming foods, then obviously it's a smaller percentage that you actually produce relative to the amount that you consume. But the other aspect is that oxalates come in different shapes and forms. So the predominant one that people think of is calcium oxalate, which is related to your kidney health. I'll get into that in just a second. But when we consume oxalates, the only one that's actually absorbed is the free oxalates, which tend to be a much smaller percentage of most foods. There's some foods that have much higher levels. But in addition to that, if you consume oxalate-rich foods with other foods, a lot of those chelate, they bind. So if you were to consume, let's say, for example, if you were to consume calcium plus oxalate-rich food and it's free oxalates, those will bind. And then you might be thinking, well, wait a second, calcium oxalates were found in the breast tissue. They were also found in the kidneys. So therefore, it might be a problem. The problem is it doesn't get absorbed. So if it chelates in your intestines, you just excrete it and it's done. But if it chelates in once it's past the intestinal lumen and it's actually passed into your bloodstream and gone to these different tissues and then chelates, that can be potentially a problem. And that's where the kidney aspect comes in. So to be 100% transparent, I haven't looked into the kidney aspect with enough depth, but the little blurbs that I read from some of the scientific reviews seems to indicate that there might be a risk for kidney. It's like big red flashing warning signs until I've actually read all the literature like I do with my study analyses and actually really look at the data. I'm going to separate myself from that comment to a great degree, but so I'll just say that's what I read from a few reviews, but there's definitely an association between the two, but if it's actually causative, I don't know yet. So that's something I'll look into. But and one more thing that I'll say on the oxalate standpoint, that when there's a small subset of people that actually are hyperoxalate absorbers. And those individuals, from what I remember, do have a higher risk, not of cancer, of kidney dysfunction. So like creating like kidney stones and whatnot. And that's because they're consuming thousands of milligrams of oxalates, not because they maybe want to be, but because they are just these hyper absorbers of oxalates, which is a small subset of the population, but there is that subset of the population. So, if you are one of those individuals, maybe, again, I'd have to look at the literature in more depth, but maybe it might be worthwhile to avoid high oxalate foods. So there's kind of my stance on oxalates up to this point. I'm not going to. Another thing you have to consider is the fact that like these high oxalate foods, they have other components within them. One, that chelate those oxalates, but the second thing is also that there's other benefits of these foods. So just avoiding them entirely just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Oh, I did look at one other aspect as well. So looking at soy protein, which soy has high amounts of oxalates as well. And I looked at a few other nutrients as well. And so when you look at the associations between breast cancer and those foods, you either see no increase in breast cancer with the high oxalate consuming foods, or you see a slight reduction in breast cancer. So if it's causative, it's clearly doing a pretty horrible job, because you would see a spike, even though with an association, you would think that if it's causing it, you would have to have some sort of an association there. And it doesn't seem to bear out in the literature. So I briefly looked at that as well. So my concern for oxalates in terms of cancer is close to zero. And although certainly, we need a lot more research on the topic, but, as it stands, I would say it's pretty close to zero. And oxalates on kidney function, that's something I need to investigate further, so don't quote me on that quite yet. But if you're a hyperabsorber of oxalates, yeah, it might be prudent to avoid oxalate consuming foods, and try to find other ways of getting those nutrients that would be also coming with the oxalate foods. All right, the next topic is creatine as a nootropic. But coffee break. Creatine is a nootropic. Here we go. All right, so you have likely heard, it's almost every science channel on earth has talked about creatine in relation to muscle. And I decided to take a different spin on it because I think that's been beaten to the ground. There's hundreds and hundreds of studies on creatine monohydrate, creatine in general, if that's HCl or pyruvate, whatever version that you're talking about, it doesn't matter. There's a bunch of studies on the topic. So I decided to go a different avenue because I just wanted to do something different. And so I looked at it in the brain. And in the brain, it seems that creatine may have a benefit as well. And I'd suspected this. I wrote a book on creatine a few years ago, and I don't really publicize. I don't usually publicize it that much because it was more of just a personal project. I just decided to just do it because I wanted to write a book by a certain age, so I just did it. However, and that was actually during quarantine as well. I was like, well, not that I didn't have any stressors in my life at that point, but I just made a personal goal and I just did it. So anyway, this isn't about the book. The point is that with creatine consumption, I looked at 5 studies, including a meta-analysis of like 8, I guess 8 studies or something like that. And inside that meta-analysis, they ended up concluding that creatine is a benefit to the brain, specifically to memory. And because that was what they were focused on. But what they mentioned was that it seems unlikely that creatine is a benefit to younger individuals. So what I mean by younger is below the age of 60 or so. And it does seem to be a benefit to people over the age of 60. So that's the conclusion from the meta-analysis. However, I took things multiple steps deeper. And for the Physionic Insiders, I talked about a number of other topics related to creatine as a nootropic. I actually also did an office hours where I went over other nootropics. But in general, my impression is that creatine does seem to have a benefit on the brain and potentially on the nervous system as a whole. The specifics of that I'll leave for my Insider podcast, but as it stands, I'll say that anecdotally, I've been taking creatine for, let's see now, at least 15 years, nonstop. And I always like to throw in jokes that my head fell off only twice and stuff like that. But no, nothing bad has happened. Of course, it's just me, and anecdote means very little to a science brand, which I feel like I have to constantly remind people. But that's been my experience. It's been good, especially definitely from a performance standpoint. I mean, muscle centric, 100%. Can't recommend creatine enough. As a matter of fact, I have it in my water right here. And the dosages really vary depending on your body size. And it may vary depending on if you're trying to go for brain-centric versus muscle-centric, which I'm still kind of teasing out that data, but, well, actually, I guess I'm not. I have an impression that maybe more creatine than what would be deemed for muscle-centric seems to be potentially beneficial for the brain. However, I will throw out that I have very little evidence for that impression. So I would be not at all insulted, and I would actually potentially like shake your hand and agree with you if you said, nah, I think I'm just going to stick with the 5 grams, which is the typical recommendation for muscle-centric creatine consumption. And the reason why I say that more may be present, because some of the studies that I looked at used a much higher dose. And when I had initially gone through the research for the book that I'd written, it seemed to me that I was seeing this consistent lack of an effect for the brain when looking at lower doses. And I was seeing a more consistent, but not universal, but more consistent effect when looking at higher doses. So that's where I created this like potential line of, okay, there might be a benefit for the brain. And the reason why there might be this increased need for the brain is because the brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier, and creatine does enter the brain, but the brain has its own creatine shuttling system. So the body has, as far as I'm aware, 2 different creatine shuttling system. So it produces its own creatine. And that creatine starts out, let's say, you'll have components that are made in the liver, then those get exported to the kidneys, or maybe it's the reverse. Maybe it's the kidneys then to the liver. Either way, you have this exchange between the kidneys and the liver, and then those end up at the muscle as creatine. Now, in the brain, we also have cells that produce their own creatine and then shuttle those to the neurons, which are the actual parts that allow us to think. And when we consume creatine, it's possible that when we're feeding our entire musculature, that you may need to have more for it to also have an effect on the brain. Again, I'm not completely convinced of that perspective, and I think that it's perfectly reasonable to use just kind of the standard amounts that people use. So, but regardless, no matter what, there is pretty good evidence at this point that creatine does help our nervous system and our brain, and especially in older individuals, it seems to have pretty profound effects. Okay, so that's creatine as a nootropic. The next one is to cover niacin on heart disease. Whew, man, oh man. This is a okay. This is a heavy hitting topic. I don't know if you heard this in the recording, but there's a train outside that just blasted its horn at the perfect time, right at a silent section. Maybe I'll be able to edit that out. If not, then don't think that I cursed and then it just went beep. No. Anyway, beside the point, niacin and heart disease was a real heavy hitter that I did not expect to be a heavy hitter. I just decided to look into it because I thought, this is interesting. I don't even know how my mind got onto the topic, but this was a topic that I didn't realize was going to be so contentious. I didn't realize it was going to be such a hot button topic for some people. And it certainly has a lot to do with statins and heart disease, and I'll get into that in just a little bit, not into that much detail with statins, but why statins are related to this topic. So I pulled together a number of different studies on niacin and heart disease, looked at a bunch of different meta-analyses that pulled together, I don't know, like 30 or 40 different studies on the topic. And I ended up getting to this point where I was thinking, I feel like we're getting a little premature with our dismissal of niacin. The reason why I say that is because all the studies that I looked at, and I opened up a lot of these individual studies, not all of them, but a lot of the individual studies, and obviously looking at the meta-analyses, the comparators, so what they were comparing niacin supplementation compared to what. And what they were comparing against was statins for all of the meta-analysis. Every single meta-analysis that I had opened was comparing against statins, which is fine. Like that's, whatever. But if you were to just read the meta-analysis, just the abstract, they never made that clear. And it wasn't until I'd been reading these analyses for like an hour that because I have the system of stepwise, like this is what I need to look at. Now look at this, checkbox this, all these different things that I'm constantly trying to improve. And that's where this checklist really helped, because I was like, wait, what are they comparing against? And what they were comparing against was statins. And I was like, all right, so hold on. We're saying that niacin supplementation does not have a cardioprotective effect, does not have a cardiovascular benefit. But that's compared against statins. So if we accept that statins are a cardioprotective effect, don't shoot me, please. There's so many people that are against statins. I have not looked over the statin research. Please do not ostracize me. I mean, it is crazy that I say the word statin I'm not even talking about, and people are like, "Ugh, no, statins are, big pharma's trying to take us down." It's like, this is not what this topic is about. It's about niacin and cardiovascular disease. And I'll bet you have not looked at the research on statins. Even if you find it completely corrupt, I will say there is research out there by independent groups that have nothing to do with pharma that have also looked at statins. But I'm not going to put my opinion out there yet because I have not actually done this deep dive. So we'll see. Maybe I'll be surprised. Who knows? Maybe I'll be shocked. So it always makes me laugh. Okay. Anyway, I'll put that aside. So they were comparing niacin against statins, and I was just like, okay. So if we go with the established idea that statins help with a cardioprotective effect, then the fact that niacin did not do worse than statins, wouldn't that also indicate that niacin potentially has a benefit to the heart? And none of these meta-analyses looked at anything other than a comparison versus statins. And again, I have a very optimistic standpoint. I'm not saying that these researchers were trying to hide anything. This is just what they decide to compare against because it is the current, one of the most popular ways of dealing with cardiovascular disease. All right. But one meta-analysis did look at niacin versus non-statin therapy. So there's most likely never going to be like a placebo or like a straight up control group where they just give them a sugar pill or an inert pill, mainly because that would be unethical by researchers to say, hey, we want to study cardiovascular disease and we would like you to be on a placebo or have the potential to be on a placebo because you'd be double blind, so you wouldn't know what condition you're in. But we would like half of these individuals to be on a placebo where they are at higher risk of having a heart disease. And we will not be helping these people. You can't do that. Like as a researcher, as the ethics boards have become, I don't want to say more ethical, but they've just like, we've thought about this more, the philosophy of the situation, the psychology of the situation, the sociology. We've come to these new understandings of we need to be helping everyone. We can't, even for the sake of science, we can't just put people on a placebo. So as a result, these researchers had to compare niacin supplementation versus a non-statin therapy. So I don't know, we're talking about like something that might be like more inert. I don't know all the different non-statin therapies, so I'm kind of struggling here from a clinical standpoint. What would be something else that they could put in? I'm not talking about like exercise interventions or anything like that. I'm talking about actual drugs or actual molecules that are they just don't work like statins. So they compared it against those, and I was really glad that they did. And I have to give these researchers some major props for actually doing that, because there were multiple indices, there were multiple measures, and the reason why all these other studies, all these other meta-analyses were looking at versus statins. What was unique about this study, even though their main data that they looked at was also against statins, in their supplementary information, they had done an analysis against these non-statin therapies. And it was remarkable on multiple metrics: stroke, acute coronary syndrome, major adverse coronary events, so it's MACE. All of them seemed to perform to indicate improvements with the niacin condition versus these non-statin therapies, which if that hadn't been the case, I think I would have been pretty confused. I mean, I would have had to figure out some sort of physiological reason as to why, but that made a lot of sense to me. Now, not every metric improved, but that could be due to a number of statistical reasons. Again, not because statistics is fake and all that, which is another thing that I've heard from people saying, like, if you ever, I don't know, I forgot what the line is, but it's something like, if you want to if you want to find an effect, just change the statistics or something like that. It's not, there are certain rules that we have to follow when it comes to statistics. So anyway, I'll put that aside. But for a number of these different metrics, there were improvements with niacin supplementation. And that just led me to sit here and think like, okay, so we're seeing some improvements when you're not comparing statins against statins. You're not seeing any improvements when you're comparing against statins, which doesn't mean that's not an indictment against niacin. That's just essentially indicating, okay, there's no difference between the two. So, and then if you look at the mechanism, which is where I was getting super confused by the fact that there were no effects of niacin. This is before I knew that they were comparing against statins. The mechanism is, or not really the mechanism, but just the effect that niacin has, physiologically speaking. It massively drops LDL levels, which is what we talked about earlier. It increases HDL, which I haven't looked at that research to any great detail, but there isn't nearly as much of a link between HDL and heart disease, the direct effect, I should say, in heart disease prevention. And it massively reduced triglycerides. So 3 effects: massive reduction in LDL, spike in HDL, drop in triglycerides. Okay, so all of that to me was like, okay, well, it's not like a 5-point shift. I'm talking like 30 points, 50-point drops in these metrics, which are sizable drops. I mean, this is a powerful substance. And it was baffling to me that we wouldn't see any sort of positive effect if you believe, of course, that LDL and cholesterol and all that affect heart disease, which of course I do because I've looked at that literature. But now it made a lot more sense once they were comparing against these non-cholesterol affecting drugs, these more mild drugs that they were using to help these individuals. Suddenly niacin became a lot more powerful and suddenly had a lot more of an effect, which one speaks to the whole cholesterol hypothesis or theory of heart disease. But the other aspect is, which, let me speak to that real quick. I know I'm derailing, but I want you to follow that train of thought. People that don't believe in statins, again, I'm not speaking to like, do I believe statins work and whatnot, but the predominant idea is that statins lower your cholesterol burden, right? People say that statins are a scam because the cholesterol, one of the arguments I'll say is that statins lower cholesterol. Cholesterol is not associated to heart disease risk, which is complete bunk, but let me just run with it. So I've had people comment, that's why they prefer niacin, but it does the exact same thing. I mean, make it make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. Like if you believe one, you have to believe the other. Like, and then I'll take it a step further in just a second. So anyway, the point being that niacin seemed to have an effect on some, not all the metrics, but that again, maybe because of they didn't have enough statistical power, they didn't have enough studies and whatnot. And then there are studies that have been done with niacin, these large scale trials with niacin, not looking at statins, like versus non-statin therapies. And the reason for that is because statins didn't exist because they were invented. I don't remember I don't know the exact time. Again, I haven't looked at statin research. So beyond this comparison. So there's a study back in the 1960s, I think, called the CDP trial. And from what I read, it seemed that niacin did have a benefit to the people that were taking niacin. And that was compared against like a bunch of other therapies that they thought at the time could help, but those didn't help nearly as much, if I remember that correctly. So this massive trial was also included in this meta-analysis, and along with some of the other smaller trials that were done afterwards. And it just seemed that, yeah, niacin seems to help. Okay, great. The drawback of niacin, however, is that it also increases diabetes risk. Now, where have we heard this before? Now, if you're familiar with statin research, you will know that some of the critiques, I don't know if they're founded or unfounded, just to be clear, because again, I have to keep repeating myself. I realize I'm being repetitive, but it's remarkable to me how many times people will go through videos and then will call me some name or say, why didn't you cover this, or whatever it is. It's like, even though I say it, I literally say it, and then people just gloss over or they just skip over. I don't know what it is. So I'm repeating myself several times. You'll have to excuse me. I'm sorry. So the idea is that statins also increase the risk of diabetes. So we're seeing this parallel between these two. Like, they work differently in terms of the actual cellular mechanisms, but they both cause the same potential risks, and they both cause the same effects: lowering LDL cholesterol, containing cholesterol, and they increase the risk of diabetes. Again, assuming that with statins that truly is the case. So we're seeing a lot of these parallels between the two, and again, when you're comparing niacin against non-statin therapies, you're seeing a benefit, or at least some benefit. And when you're comparing against statins doesn't outperform niacin, just to be clear. Niacin doesn't outperform statins. So we're seeing so many different parallels here. And there's a lot more nuance that goes into this that I can't really get into right now, because again, we have so many other topics that I still need to get into. But like dosing, for example, is super important. And the way to mitigate like diabetes risk is another aspect that I think that, like, for example, the mechanism for why we see this increase in diabetes risk is, I think, because we're having this significant change in the metabolism or the physiology of the body. You're essentially artificially lowering the triglyceride transport, LDL transport, et cetera, or cholesterol transport, which is through this mechanism of LDL. So that may be having an effect on the metabolism of the body, because you have to get nutrients to the body somehow. If you're going to dramatically drop LDL, something else has to account for that. And I mentioned this to the Physionic insiders, actually, a mechanism for why that might be happening. And I think it's because you see this increase in blood sugar as a result. So there are ways of mitigating that, or not necessarily mitigating, but like keeping an eye on it, so that you make sure that if you're using statins or if you're using niacin, that you would be able to at least long-term see if you're falling into that risk category. Another drawback of niacin, which is not experienced with statins, as far as I'm aware, is flushing, which some people really enjoy it, but this kind of itchiness or redness that occurs with niacin, and that can be mitigated by the type of niacin. Again, there's a lot of complexity here that I can't get into at the moment, but there's just so much. I guess the last thing I'll say on this is I've been really blown away by how dismissive people are of niacin, when there's, I think, good research that's been done that indicates it is not nearly as useless as people have indicated. And again, I think I'll say this selfishly. I will say this selfishly. I've been really proud of the fact that I have gone into the literature with no idea what I was going to find because I didn't know much about niacin. I really didn't. I mean, I know it's a B vitamin, but beyond that, like I didn't know that much about it. So, and then upon educating myself on it and actually looking at the literature, coming out with this much more nuanced explanation that I feel like so many people are just not discussing. I'm not saying niacin is better than statins because again, I haven't looked at the statin research, but it's baffling to me that somebody would just immediately say, oh, niacin is just a useless supplement. It doesn't help with heart disease. When I would then ask them, okay, well, what doses did you look at? Did you look at an extended release formulation or an immediate release formulation? Were the consumption patterns with food or without food? Would you, what kind of metrics did you look at? What were the comparators looked at? Like there's so many different nuanced questions that need to be asked, because if you were to read, again, just to repeat this from before, if you were to read the abstracts to every single one of these meta-analyses that I read, all of them concluded that niacin did not have an effect. But you would have to really dig deeper and look at the comparators to see, oh, what they mean is it's not useful relative to statins, which is fair. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that niacin is useless. You would just then need to look for an analysis that then compares against non-statins, which we have one as far as I'm aware, and it seems to show that there is some benefit. And the researchers acknowledge as much in the discussion section as well. But they also acknowledge that we need more research on the topic, which I agree. So look, I mean, I'm just talking about the research that I've looked at. Maybe I'm missing something. Hey, it's entirely possible that I'm missing something as well. I don't think that I am, but it's possible. It's always possible. So I'm willing to have like discussions about the topic because it always makes me feel a little uncomfortable to be going against kind of the the established norm. I don't actually fully know what the established norm is in relation to niacin, but it does make me feel a little uncomfortable. I'm always going to be 100% comfortable following what my eyes have seen, what my data analysis has shown. But I also acknowledge that I'm still learning a lot and that it's entirely possible that like a cardiologist who specializes in this stuff, or an cardiology epidemiologist that specializes in this stuff would be able to explain certain nuances to me that I don't understand yet. But so far, I haven't run across anyone. And I will, in my defense as well, I will also say there are researchers that actually agree. And I covered some of that, again, for the insider's version of my niacin analysis, going into some of those specifics. And those researchers pointed out some of the things that a priority, as in like I came up with these conclusions before I read their analysis or their scientific review. And then I read their scientific review. I was like, wow, I came to the same conclusions that they did on a number of factors. There were a few points that I thought were missing the mark. Like I didn't feel those were good arguments, but yeah, it's just it's a tricky subject, and it's something I'm trying to be careful about. But at a certain point, I have to actually say something. I can't keep waffling around when I see evidence to the contrary. No matter what, I'd like to see more data on the topic. I'd like to see more analyses that specifically look at niacin versus non-statin therapies beyond the one that I looked at, to be really sure of myself. It's a difficult position to be in. And I know I'm kind of rambling here. I'm really thinking about this. it's a difficult position to be in, to be aware of data and to also be aware that you could be wrong and there's a blind spot that you're not seeing. And that blind spot is potentially going to affect how people see the work. Like, I'm putting out information and people are expecting me to be an expert on a topic. Like, when I'm talking about this subject, I've read a lot of studies on the topic, but that still doesn't mean that I'm infallible. And that is a scary prospect, because there might be a day where I say something that's not necessarily in line with how the established conclusion is. And then I'm going to be wondering, like, I guess that's it. Like, I'm wondering, are they seeing something that I'm just not? What's going on here? You know, I don't know. It's a tough position to be in. This niacin thing is, again, it's not an indictment against statins or anything like that. But I just don't want to be putting out information out there that will then have people thinking, oh, well, in that case, I'm going to stop my statin therapy and jump over to niacin. That's a tough bargain to strike. And I take that incredibly seriously. And of course, I mean, my ultimate recommendation is always to talk to your physician. The problem is then people come back and say, well, my physician's just going to tell me to just stick to statins, which, I mean, I understand, like, you know, looking over this research is difficult work. And a physician just does not have the time to go through all of this literature and really pore over the data. But considering, I do take some solace in the fact that, one, other researchers have pointed this out as well, so I'm not alone. And the second thing is that I think there is solace in the fact that the effects are similar to what you would see, and the mechanism, right, is similar to what you would see with statin therapy, with which, you know, thousands of researchers agree that statin therapies seem to work. Again, once I look into it, I will be able to tell you definitively I agree or disagree. But as it stands, I have to remove myself, because I don't want to be one of those people that's just like, well, thousands of researchers say so, which of course I respect that consensus. And which is why I'm in this position right here. It's exactly why I'm in this position. So yeah, I realize maybe it's a little bit unsatisfactory, and I'm bloviating on at this point about the topic, but it is a struggle in my mind. Hopefully you're getting some sense of how much I have to think about and weigh the effects of what I say on people's potential behavior, because I don't take that lightly. And I also understand how difficult it is for someone who is relying on information to be well thought out, to be scientifically backed, to be data driven, and also for the analysis of that data to be well done. And then to bring that to a physician, and then that physician, the position that they're in, because then they have to say, okay, I have to sit down and go through all this data myself and figure out if I can actually recommend to my patient to use niacin as an addition to their treatment for heart disease or whatever it might be. Yeah, it's a tough position to be in, but I guess the best I can do, and this is the last thing I'll say on the topic, the best I can do is that people are always welcome to reach out to me if they disagree. The one criteria, well, there's a few different criteria. One is you have, be respectful and whatnot when you disagree with me. I 100%, I love it when people disagree with me because it potentially offers me an opportunity to correct myself, which is ultimately what I'm most interested in, is getting the correct information out. But additionally, on top of that, it needs to be science-based and it needs to explain the data that I have already looked over. Like just adding another study to the pile doesn't do a whole lot to budge me in one way or another. Unless that study reinterprets everything that addresses everything I said and introduces me to my blind spot, then I'm like, oh, wow, okay, brilliant. But on the other hand, it's throwing a study at me when I've already analyzed, 20 other studies on the topic just doesn't do much to budge me. One contradictory study versus like 20 or 5 or 10 or whatever other studies. Of course, I'll read it, but I need more than that. So, and I was actually approached. I guess I do have one more thing to say about the topic. I was actually approached by somebody about this very topic, the niacin topic. And I appreciated that this person wanted to correct me on a few things. And I did add an amendment for one of the things that they mentioned, because there was, I'm not going to go into the specifics because it's a bore to listen to, but it had to do with the statistics. When in my video, I had mentioned the p-value was in relation to what's known as the overall effect as opposed to the heterogeneity. Those are two different things, but I had incorrectly attributed the p-value to the overall effect because the way the researchers had written it, it was incredibly unclear. They just didn't make it clear at all. And later on, they had mentioned it a little bit, but it made it seem like it was towards the overall effect. So anyway, I had a lovely conversation with this person, and we came to an agreement that I was probably wrong on this topic. So I made an amendment to the video and made people aware of it and pinned it and all that good stuff. Ultimately, it didn't change the interpretation of the data, though. That was the thing. Like the overall interpretation of the data seemed to me pretty clearly that exactly what I just explained to you, in far fewer words than it took me this time around, mainly because I'm struggling with my own cognitive deficits. And then we had a conversation about like the actual material of the data, and I just didn't feel like the data presented, or the person was putting out arguments saying like, in relation to this niacin versus the comparator, against statins or non-statins, I just didn't feel like their arguments made sense. Like I even pointed out, like, because they said, okay, well, or I had pointed out to them that certain studies, if you open up the actual individual studies themselves, that they clearly show that niacin seems to have a benefit, and they are not comparing against statins. And I think even they made the mistake, the person I was talking to, they made the mistake of assuming that all the studies they did the exact same thing that I did initially with the meta-analysis of looking at this study and just saying, well, there's no effect. And then they ended up doing more statistics themselves on the data that they had looked at over time. And I found myself wondering if the statistics were being muddled, or not muddled, but were being mixed with the statin data plus the non-statin data. So I realize I'm making a mess of this. Like the explanation of this is so difficult if you're not in the field. Yeah, and I have such difficulty saying just trust me in this situation because of all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I guess all I can say is that I still believe the conclusions that I came to. That, again, not speaking to statins, but that niacin may be a benefit, and we need more data on the topic that specifically look at non-statin therapies. And I'd like to see where the future brings us in relation to niacin therapy. And people are going to have, of course, a negative perspective where they're going to say, well, nobody's going to fund niacin studies because there's no money in it and whatnot. There's a lot of researchers that do research that doesn't have money related to it. They just do research because they get public funding from it. Not saying pharmaceutical industry funding may necessarily be attributed to it. I get you on that point, but there could be other research that's done. It's just that you have to have a real basis for why you would want to do that research. So anyway, I'm not gonna talk about this much longer. But I think I'll just say if I ever change my mind about niacin, and somebody comes forward and really has a discussion with me and we can parse through the data again and come to an understanding, maybe I'll learn something that ultimately is going to be clear enough that I can then really put out more content saying, hey, there's a little bit more nuance than what I expected that I've already covered. And I'll take down my previous analysis, but as it stands, I just haven't found any good evidence that if you specifically that if you look at niacin versus non-statin therapies, that there isn't a benefit. I'm not saying it's better than statins, but that there isn't any benefit whatsoever at the doses that they use and the intervals, like how they take it and all that stuff. It's just, I haven't run across any data that really convinces me strongly, but we'll see. Anyway, I apologize if this was confusing. I'm probably not going to cut this out. I just want, this podcast isn't just about just dispelling information and putting information out there. It's also just so people can experience how much I think about these things. It's not a light topic for me at all. And I value people's attention, but I value even more me getting things correct. So hopefully that came across. Okay. All right, let's move on. If that wasn't very clear to you, I understand. And I would still opt to head over to my niacin investigation as it presently stands. And if anything changes, you will see an amendment to this podcast so that would be the first thing I would tell you. Go look for an amendment attached to this podcast, wherever you're listening to it, wherever you're watching it. And it will tell you, Nick has changed his mind. This is where you should go for the updated version of his interpretation. But if you don't see that, my current interpretation is still standing, even if it's 5 years from now, just to be clear. Okay, let's switch gears to methylene blue and coffee break. Methylene blue is a substance that other people have created a lot of content on. And I was just being flooded with these asks to cover it. And I had no idea what it was. It's been around since the 1800s, but it's been used as a dye in textiles, which I thought was pretty cool. But I was like, okay, well, that's weird. Which just as an aside, which I find funny. I find this very comical. Again, just the hypocrisy of things. a lot of the people, not everyone, but a lot of the people that, for example, believe in seed oils being the detriment of all mankind and womankind, one of the arguments against seed oils is the fact that it has been used in the past in like manufacturing or something. I'm not too clear on the exactly the background of what the criticism is of seed oils. And yes, I will be covering seed oils at some point. I have so much on my plate, but at some point I will cover seed oils. But one of the criticisms against seed oils is that it's been used in manufacturing and all that. But then some of these same individuals love methylene blue when it was used in textiles hundreds of years ago. So in like manufacturing and in textiles. That just like, again, you can't have it both ways. You have to choose and then stay on that path. You can't, and then of course change based off of new data, but you can't simultaneously criticize one and then be really excited about the other one for health benefits when they're both involved in like manufacturing and the processing of non-food items. Anyway, I just find that stuff kind of comical. Methylene blue, used in textiles, 1800s, but now it's being used. I saw a few studies on the topic, and I just went over one scientific review looking at anti-aging specifically. And they mentioned that methylene blue is consumed for the prevention of skin aging because it is more effective than vitamin C and vitamin A, I want to say, which are used in serums to protect against UV radiation and just in general aging or anti-aging. And methylene blue seemed to be more effective than both of those. Now, that's just based off of a scientific review. I'm not sure if the research was in randomized controlled trials or anything like that, so I'm kind of iffy on if that's truly the case. Mechanistically, it was the case, but if that's actually true in application, we don't know, as far as I'm aware. That said, another area that it's been looked at is in brain health, and the evidence was a little spotty in relation to like Alzheimer's and dementia and whatnot. So I was not altogether that convinced, but again, it's just a few studies. So, and some of the critiques is that they use different versions of methylene blue, so maybe not actually methylene blue. So, you know, there's a lot of waffling back and forth there. I'm not, again, as it stands, we'll just say that there isn't that much great evidence in favor yet, but that's, you know, if you just have two studies on a topic, it's kind of hard to say, well, it's useless. It doesn't do anything. I mean, you probably need a lot more. And mechanistically, what I found really fascinating about methylene blue, which was super cool, is that it has two mechanisms of action. One of them is a really common one that you would find with like vitamin E or vitamin A or vitamin C or, you know, any one, glutathione, Glynac, whatever, you know, whatever. And that is that it's a antioxidant. So it eliminates reactive oxygen species, free radicals and whatnot. So that's great. But the more interesting one for me is the effect that it has in mitochondria, mechanistically speaking. So methylene blue is actually attracted to the inside of the cell because of I want to say it's attracted to highly negative environments. So the charge of the cell, so the outside of the cell is more positive, the inside of the cell is more negative. And then the inside of the mitochondrion is even more negative. So the polarity between those two, between the inside of the cell, which is negative, but the inside of the mitochondria, which is even more negative, there's a polarity there. There's a difference there. So the methylene blue is attracted to mitochondria. So it will find its way into the matrix or the very intersection of the mitochondrion. And there we've got the mitochondria is made up of two membranes, the outer membrane, the inner membrane. The inner membrane touches the inside of the inner membrane, touches the very inside of the mitochondrion called the matrix. Now, methylene blue finds its way into the matrix and embedded into the membrane of the inner membrane of the mitochondrion are these proteins called the complexes, complex 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the electron transport chain. And those actually allow for the production of ATP, or cellular energy. I've covered this many times before, but I'll cover it one more time. So the normal function of mitochondria would be to take foodstuffs, glucose, fatty acids, fat molecules, glucose being sugar or carbohydrates. And once they go through their metabolism, they get transformed a number of different ways. They eventually get turned into, at the very end, when we're talking about mitochondria, they eventually get turned into NADH and FADH, which are like metabolism molecules that feed the electron transport chain. Now, they have electrons, so they take up electrons, so that's a component of a molecule, and then donate those electrons to the mitochondrion. So NADH, which we'll be talking about NAD in a little bit, but NADH donates an electron to the electron transport chain, and then the electron transport chain, guess what it does? It transports the electron from complex 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, technically. It stops at 4. And then from there, it allows, I'm not going to go into too much more detail on this, but it allows the electron transport chain, in very basic terms, to generate ATP because this electron gets moved from one complex to another. There's more to it than that, but just that's what you need to know. Now, the problem is if you have large amounts of NADH and FADH that are donating electrons, that the complexes can essentially become overwhelmed, where the electrons will not cleanly be shifted from complex 1 to complex 3 or complex 2 to complex 3, but can actually slip. So you have a process called electron slippage, or that's how I like to consider, that's what I was taught in my master's program. And these electrons then interact with any number of different molecules, but essentially create reactive oxygen species. So we get these damaging molecules that are produced, and they damage surrounding components of the cell, and that leads to the aging of the cell, the damage of the cell, and just so on and so forth. Bad things happen to the cell. Now, methylene blue, what it does is it can eliminate those reactive oxygen species, right? It itself, the molecule itself, will interact with the electrons or the reactive oxygen species and neutralize them. Okay, great. So that's one thing, but that's not really that unique because so many other molecules do it. Maybe methylene blue does it more effectively, but so many other molecules do that. Okay. So the other benefit, though, is that methylene blue will actually take up electrons from NADH. And instead of NADH going to complex 1 and then going through this electron transfer, methylene blue will deliver the electrons to complex 4, if I remember correctly. And that will bypass 2 of the complexes, 1 and 3. Yeah, 1 and 3 that are most prone to electron slippage. So these complexes generate a lot of reactive oxygen species when there's an abundance of NADH. But if methylene blue is present, it will remove some of that NADH, take the burden of NADH, the electron from NADH, and deliver it directly to complex 4, which will then allow us to bypass even the production of oxidative stress or the reactive oxygen species, which then lowers the damage that occurs over time to the cells, and which will ultimately allow mitochondria to still generate energy, but without the potential damage that's being incurred from the electron slippage, which I thought was just such a cool mechanism. I've never seen that before, and I've never heard of that before until these researchers pointed out in this scientific review. That said, however, the actual effectiveness of methylene blue, I don't know. Like I don't think there's that much research on the topic. There, at least I'll say randomized control trials. There's some, but there isn't a whole lot. So maybe I'll look into it more. I thought that video or that topic was going to really do very well. It did not do very well. And unfortunately, because I have, I spend a lot of money on Physionic, like putting out videos. I can't invest more time and money into covering topics that ultimately just don't help that many people. They may be interesting, and I do cover some topics that I just find interesting, but I also have to gear things towards what's going to help the most number of people. And these hyper-specific topics, I was asked over and over and over to cover it. So I thought, hey, maybe there's a large group of people, but really it's just a minority of people that are just really interested in methylene blue. So we'll be talking about more about methylene blue in this podcast, actually, because I'm going to go over a few of the experiences that people have had, the anecdotes that people have had with methylene blue a little bit later on when we get to the comments section. But as it stands, I'm not like blown away. I don't think the data is that conclusive, I'll just say we need a lot more data on methylene blue, more than probably most of these other topics. Okay, the next topic is to cover NMN on health. Okay, NMN on health. This is this is another topic that I was asked a whole lot about. So many people were reaching out and saying, can you cover NMN? Can you cover NMN? Again, not something that I was very familiar with. Obviously, I know about NAD. I know about NADH. It has strong effects, it has massive effects in mitochondria. But NAD also has effects in other parts of the cell as well. And NMN, which is a nicotinamide mononucleotide, is this molecule that gets converted into NAD. And NAD is this kind of precursor molecule for a number of different reactions in our cell. For example, they affect mitochondria, obviously, like I mentioned with NADH. NADH is the reduced version of, I shouldn't even use chemistry terms if I'm explaining this, to be honest. NADH is NAD plus or NAD. I'm not even going to say NAD plus, just NAD. NMN gets converted to NAD. NAD then gets converted to NADH. NADH is NAD with an extra electron on it, okay? And then that gets delivered to complex 1 of mitochondria and then goes through the energy generation. That was the point of, or technically it's NADH2, but we'll put that aside. It doesn't matter. So NADH is this version of NAD with an electron or added electrons to it. So that's all you really need to know. So it feeds mitochondria for energy generation. On the other hand, NAD itself can also have an effect on sirtuins. So sirtuins are these enzymes that control our gene expression, and they can control the separation or the tightness of the histones, which are these proteins. Your genes are coiled around these histones. Think of them like your genes like a snake, and it's coiled around this stone. And these histones are either in close conformation, they're very close to one another, which means that other enzymes cannot come in and read the genes, or they are separated from one another, where other enzymes can come in and actually attach to the DNA, to the genes, and read them and produce mRNA and then produce proteins. So sirtuins have a role in that they control the acetylation or the tagging of these histones, which influences the histones to close or to open. All right, so NAD then is involved in this process because it is involved in the acetylation and deacetylation. So deacetylation would be removing an acetyl tag. And so NAD is used by these sirtuins to allow for this whole process to occur. So those are just two of the different mechanisms, but there are other mechanisms by which NAD has tremendous effects within the body. within our cells. So the idea here is that there's a lot of research in animals that has shown that over time, with age, we see decreases in NAD levels. And the idea was then that, okay, well, if that's the case, then why don't we boost our cellular NAD levels? And then we might be able to recover a lot of, mitochondrial function, maybe have an effect on gene expression, all these different things, stem cellness, all this stuff. So the idea was that if we supplement with NMN, the precursor to NAD, which is, if I remember correctly, the reason why we don't supplement with NAD specifically is because NAD is far less secure, and that's not the correct, stable, that's the word I'm looking for. It's not as stable as NMN, so it gets eliminated or degraded very quickly. So NMN is more stable, if I remember correctly. So if we consume NMN, then it will find its way into our cells and then get converted from NMN to NAD, thereby increasing our NAD levels. So that's the idea. But I looked over, okay, so this is what I did. I looked over 13 studies, and apparently there are more studies than 13. I thought that I'd covered all of them. I looked all over for them. But I looked at 13 studies, human randomized control trials, or most of them were human randomized control trials. All of them were in humans. And apparently there are like 15 studies at this point. So I covered definitely the vast majority of the NMN studies that have been done in humans. And after looking over all of them, the conclusion was that NMN is kind of meh. I'm not saying that it doesn't have any effect whatsoever, but there's a lot of, and I always use this word, nuance that's involved, because NMN supplementation seems to have positive effects for some people and seems to have zero effect on other people. So based on 13 studies, which, to be frank with you, I would probably need like 50 or 100 studies to really create these pockets of NMN effective for these people, NMN effective for these people, NMN not effective for these people, and be able to really create these pockets of how NMN functions. So what I ended up, based on this preliminary evidence, indicating is that NMN seems to be effective for people that are probably a little bit older, let's say in like maybe late 50s, 60s, and beyond. It seemed like NMN supplementation seemed to have an effect. And it may have an effect on younger individuals who are maybe suffering or dealing with some sort of issue, some sort of health issue where NAD levels, boosting NAD levels seem to potentially have a benefit. However, for most people that are not dealing with any sort of chronic problem or not dealing with any sort of health struggle, and they are below the age of 50, almost all the studies showed just about no effect. And then all the studies that looked at younger individuals, again, that maybe had prediabetes, like there was one study in women in their 30s that had prediabetes, and it did seem to have an effect. So, it's tough to tease out. There, again, for the Physionic insiders, I'd mentioned there were some exceptions to these rules that I'm creating, but for the most part, it seems like that's the case. That those are the buckets that I would currently put NMN in. However, I also don't think that NMN has these tremendous effects. For no one does it have incredible effects where you take NMN and the next day you're just like, I can now run a marathon. It's more mild to maybe moderate effects depending on the severity of the problem that you're dealing with. So, definitely, I think that we need more data on the topic. Some of the criticisms that were levied, which I think are very good criticisms, fair criticisms, are the dosages that were used in the studies. Some of the studies used 250 milligrams. Some of them went up to several grams. The one problem that I have with that argument is that some studies that did show a benefit of NMN used 250 milligrams. And then some of the studies that did not find an effect used a gram or more. And so I don't think that argument is all that good. I think it's fair, but once you actually examine it, I don't think that it's that great because there's no consistency there. The other aspect that was brought up is, well, we shouldn't be looking at these types of metrics that the researchers would look at. People were disappointed that they would look at like cholesterol levels or blood pressure or, all these different metrics like that. And you know what, that's fair. But at least from an anti-aging standpoint, I mean, these blood markers matter a lot. They're a huge factor. So to see no effect, I mean, because the translation here, right, is your cells are the ones producing these molecules and putting them in the blood. So if you have a dysregulation of any one of these systems, if NAD were to have an effect on them, then it would improve that system and you would see that reflected in the blood. Now, that doesn't universally happen, of course. So people were then saying, well, we should be looking at more cellular effects like mitochondrial dysfunction, for example, or looking at other metrics. And that's fair. That's fine. That would be interesting, and I'd be certainly open to that kind of data. Epigenetic clocks would be another one. That would be really interesting to see if NAD might have an effect. Maybe it doesn't have an effect on the blood markers if they're in kind of a normal range, which is exactly what I was talking about, why I didn't think that NMN might be effective, but maybe it has effects on mitochondrial function. That's entirely possible. So we don't know that. We'll see if we can figure that out in the future as more studies come out. But what I will say is that this hysteria about NMN and this NAD is just like, it's revolutionary and all this stuff. I think a lot of that is really on the back of animal research, which is fine. But that animal research has been far more powerful than what we've seen with the human research. I think that we should be a lot more cautious considering that the human research, even let's just say that it doesn't address any of the animal research. It doesn't look at DNA damage. It doesn't look at mitochondrial function. It doesn't look at stem cellness. It doesn't look at all the different things that we can look at in animals. I still think it's not fair to then say, oh, so therefore NMN probably still has an effect. It's like, well, you have no evidence for that. So the evidence that we do have on other metrics show it has very specific effects, like what I described with age and health. But I think it's just wrong to then to say with this confidence that NMN has these tremendous effects because we just don't have that evidence. Until we actually do, I'm just going to stick with this stance that NMN may have some mild effects for most people that fall into those two camps with age and health effects. So, I mean, I certainly wouldn't bother. Me personally, I probably will never buy NMN. And my understanding is I don't even know if you can get it anymore. I don't know what the whole politics behind that whole situation is. Something about some company blocking it from being a supplement. Now it's like a drug, or in the United States at least. I don't know what's going on with that, but it doesn't really matter to me. Again, I'm far more worried about the actual science, the actual data itself. That's all I really care about. So those are my impressions about NMN. If you have personal experiences with it, I'm going to be going over some of them in just a little bit. But if you have personal experiences with it, like, look, I'm not going to argue with you. That's great. Maybe you fall into one of those two categories, or it may, data is based off of averages. Maybe you're just out of the average, but for most people, it's probably not going to have a tremendous effect on their body. Okay, the next question is inflammation and heart disease. So this was really interesting to me as well, because people were asking me, this was a few months ago, because I'm just so slow at doing all these analyses because it takes me so much time. But inflammation and heart disease, people were asking if inflammation contributes to heart disease. Or one of the arguments that people had said is that, well, none of this matters if your inflammation is low. So heart disease doesn't occur if inflammation is low. And so we're fortunate that there are recent studies that have actually looked at this. And I can say that there aren't a whole lot of studies on the topic. And I looked at maybe 5, I want to say. So 2 of them were direct, like randomized controlled trials, and 3 of them were, I think, reviews of kind of some peripheral data that would speak to this topic. And the first randomized controlled trial used a statin. Ooh, boogeyman. Used a statin. And the reason why they used a statin was because they knew that this statin also had an effect on inflammation. So it had an effect on high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And they ended up looking at the effect that this statin had versus a placebo, if I remember correctly. But this was in a population of people that were not, if I remember correctly, not at heart disease risk. And they wanted to, so these people had relatively normal lipoprotein levels, maybe a little bit elevated, but within, like, definitely average, we'll say average. And they had high inflammatory markers, if I remember correctly. Then the statin, the idea was that the statin would preferentially reduce their inflammatory markers. But what turned out to be the case is that they actually also still saw a dramatic drop in lipoproteins. So I still covered the study because I wanted to point out some of the confounding variables there. So it didn't really give that much evidence in favor of inflammation, because you're changing 2 different variables at the same time. You're changing C-reactive protein or inflammatory markers, plus you're affecting the LDL or lipoprotein levels. So then there was this other study that was done without a statin, so specifically a drug that attacks the inflammatory profile specifically, but does not affect LDL levels or lipoprotein levels as a whole. And they showed this. They showed great data, strong non-effect of this drug on the LDL levels, on the triglyceride levels, on blood pressure, like zero effect, like absolutely zero for sure, which was awesome to see. And then the only thing that changed was this dramatic drop in this inflammatory marker. And then they measured the progression of heart disease. And what they found is that, yes, indeed, the reduction in just inflammation did ultimately lead to a drop in heart disease risk. Now, that said, there was a drawback. So on the flip side, there was a drawback in that these people also experienced more death or more risk from infections. I think we can both agree that that's not that surprising. If you dramatically drop your inflammatory metrics, which inflammation is your immune system, or at least one massive component is your immune system, then you're probably going to be more susceptible to disease, unfortunately. So, and specifically infectious disease. So there was a heightened risk of infectious disease with these individuals. And that may have actually been why I think they ended up stopping the trial early, because of that. I think because of that. But ultimately, they still were able to collect enough data to clearly show that cardiovascular disease risk was reduced compared to a placebo or not having an effect on inflammation. Yet everything else was the same, just the inflammation was different. So the mechanism for all that is that, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, that I was going to go back into this. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here again, but you have these LDLs that end up in the ApoB containing particles, that lipoproteins that find their way into the blood vessel wall. And then from there, you can have like the oxidation, for example, of the LDL or the lipoproteins, or you can have some other trigger that ultimately leads the immune cells to then infiltrate into the past the endothelial layer, that first layer, and of the blood vessel wall, and actually enter in the subendothelium, so into the intima, which is where you would find those lipoproteins stuck to those proteins, the proteoglycans that I was talking about earlier. I don't even know if I mentioned the actual protein name, but proteoglycans are the name. So proteoglycans are linked to these LDL, and if you have this buildup of this LDL, that leads to the endothelial cells as well as smooth muscle cells that are found in that region to then start releasing more pro-inflammatory molecules, specifically what are known as chemokines. These chemokines then, once they get released, they go through the entire bloodstream and whatnot, and they bind to immune cells, and those immune cells then find their way to that region of high concentration of chemokine activity. So then those immune cells will invade into past the endothelial cells or through the endothelial cells to that region and start gobbling up the oxidized LDL. We'll just stick to oxidized LDL for the time being because it is a major trigger. And this oxidized LDL is bound to by specific receptors called LOX receptors, LOX receptors. So these receptors bind to the LDL. They get taken up within the macrophages, which are the immune cells, although there are other immune cells that are also involved in. I would reference to my study analysis on that. Check that out, where I actually show images and stuff. But, you have the activity of dendritic cells, neutrophils, T cells, all that stuff. So a lot of immune activity. But let's just go with the macrophages. So these monocytes go from the bloodstream. They go into the blood vessel. They turn from monocytes to macrophages. They attach to these oxidized LDL, suck them up, endocytose, uptake the LDL particles, and then from there they end up destroying those LDL particles. But you can get, for example, cholesterol crystals that form, and because you have such a high amount of these LDL particles around, that then you get this constant uptake of this cholesterol inside the macrophages, which ultimately leads them to turn into what are known as foam cells. These foam cells have these globs, these massive depots of cholesterol that are found within them, and those then are stuck inside the macrophages, and the macrophages end up just getting stuck inside this region, inside this wall. And this ultimately leads to what's known as the necrotic core. So the macrophages they themselves will start signaling pro-inflammatory molecules and will attract more immune cells to come in and try to destroy them, to eliminate them. Now, inflammation is not necessarily always a bad thing. The thing is that the type of macrophage and the type of signal that's being released has an effect on the progression of this process. It's also known that macrophages or other immune cells can come in and actually eliminate those previous macrophages and can actually reverse some of the early stages of this atherosclerosis process, this burdening of the blood vessel wall. So it really depends on the LDL burden and a bunch of other factors, but inflammation clearly has an effect. And if you lower your inflammatory signaling, then you're going to get fewer of those immune cells to invade in and lead to the progression of atherosclerosis. That, however, again, similar to the oxidation standpoint that I pointed out, you can never eliminate your immune reaction entirely. If you do that, you will die from something else very quickly. Your immune system has to constantly be active in some form. Lowering it can help, but lowering it too low will be really detrimental because you'll die from something else. So the key is to then lower it through any number of different mechanisms. Again, if you want details, go to the Physionic Insiders. But you likely already know some of them at least. Like you can do like the basics: exercising, having positive nutrition, making sure that you're not in overweight. I mean, it's like some of this stuff is really basic that you don't need to learn any new therapies or anything like that. So the effect that lowering inflammation has is great, and that is one way to reduce cardiovascular disease risk. But that doesn't mean that if you lower your inflammation, that then you don't need to worry about LDL. Again, these are all interrelated. They're all factors, but they all matter, and you can never eliminate them. So with your macrophages, if you have high LDL and you lower your inflammatory burden, probably you will stave off heart disease for longer than if you had both of them active at the same time. But that does not mean that you are safe. You should be trying to attack all the risk factors at the same time, which you can do through broad sweeps like exercise and nutrition. So, and then sometimes you have to go beyond that. But as it stands, those are two powerful mechanisms to do both, to affect both of them. So anyway, the answer to the question, does inflammation affect heart disease? The answer is yes. And I found this to be a really fascinating investigation because I knew the answer, but I never actually looked over the literature itself, and to learn some of the mechanisms of the necrotic core and the breaking of the plaque and the smooth muscle extravasation, the movement of the smooth muscles turning into immune cells. Like, what a crazy process that happens within our body. It's really incredible. Okay, the next topic is eating to gain muscle. All right, so I wanted to touch on this in a way that you've probably never heard before. And this is something that many years ago I nerded out about this because, I got my master's in exercise physiology, but before I even entered my master's program, I was peppering my professors with these questions, trying to get to the bottom of this question. One of the main questions I was interested in was this one: why do we need to be consuming in a surplus to build muscle? And what's kind of the optimal amount to be consuming to gain muscle in kind of an optimal manner? And the reason why we need to be consuming in a surplus is because protein synthesis is an incredibly energy intensive process. So I'm going to describe this to you. I'm going to describe what happens when you go from the muscle contraction to the actual signaling of protein synthesis and the growth of the musculature. Now I'm going to hone in on the energy aspect. So let's say you lift a weight and you're lifting it and it's harder than normal. So you're pushing yourself to build more muscle. What's happening if we were to zoom into a single muscle cell, then from there, you would see that muscle cell has a number of different mechanisms that activate protein synthesis. So one of them is you have these what are known as myosin binding proteins. Myosin binding proteins are proteins that are bound to, the myosin molecule, which is one of the molecules that allows the muscle cells to actually contract. You have actin and myosin. And these can sense the activity within the muscle, we'll just put it that way, and then send a signal to the protein called mTOR. So master or mammalian target of rapamycin, or what's the new one? Mechanistic target of rapamycin. And so that's one aspect. So that's one feeding into mTOR. The other one is that you have these enzymes on the membrane of the muscle cell called phospholipases. These phospholipases will take molecules. I can't remember the name of the molecule, but it will take a molecule and convert it into, I think, phosphatidylcholine. And this molecule, when you contract, to start here, when you contract your musculature, the muscle cell membrane contracts as well. And these phospholipase enzymes will then be free as the membrane contracts and then expands again, will be free to interact just briefly with their substrate, which again, I can't remember the name of the substrate. And then I think it's some sort of acid, but it's some molecule called something acid, but I can't remember exactly. It doesn't matter. So it interacts with this molecule and turns it into phospholipase or into phosphatidylcholine. Then phosphatidylcholine will interact with mTOR. So that's another mechanism by which we're interacting with mTOR. And there are a number of other mechanisms, like there's metabolites. There's also the secretion of like testosterone or IGF-1 or like a bunch of pro-growth factors. You can also have, in early stages when you're a newbie, you can also have muscle damage that can have some effect as well on mTOR. So there's a number of different mechanisms, essentially what I'm saying. But those get translated, so you get a mechanical signal, which is the greatest driver of muscle growth, mechanical signal that has a direct effect. These molecules bind specifically to mTOR, activate it. mTOR will then phosphorylate or activate further downstream proteins like S6K, 4-EBP1, a number of different proteins. So these proteins will then have further effects on what are known as the ribosomes. So the ribosomes, one of the avenues is that they lead to gene expression. So they'll enter the nucleus, activate transcription factors, or they themselves are transcription factors, which will then bind to the genes within our cells, within our nucleus, and lead to the production of new proteins. So the genes are then converted to mRNA or messenger RNA. So let's take it for example. Let's say you wanted to create more of the contractile proteins that allow you to lift more weight next week, let's say. So you want to create more myosin, you want to create more actin, or you want to create more troponin, or I don't know, whatever else, like you want to create titin. So the transcription factors will bind to the genes for myosin and actin and will read it, literally go across, read it and produce as they're going. They're reading the gene and releasing these mRNAs, so these mRNA strands, which are just floating around. Typically, you have other proteins that will come in and regulate those mRNA, but which are called like the spliceosome, which will splice the mRNA in a particular pattern, but we'll just go past that. So the mRNA then go out of the nucleus, and there they interact with the ribosomes. The ribosomes are the ones that then attach to the mRNA at a particular site and will then start attaching proteins together based on how the ribosome is reading or chemically speaking, reading the mRNA. So the mRNA obviously is this transcript of the gene, right? So then the gene is now floating, quote unquote, floating in a template form as mRNA out in the cytosol, so outside of the nucleus. These ribosomes are then attaching to the mRNA and then reading that transcript and translating it to these protein structures. So it takes, let's say, letter number 1, and that corresponds to a particular amino acid, a particular protein amino acid. And the ribosome will then attach to what's known as a transfer RNA, so tRNA, which has this amino acid attached to the top of it, and will then combine the mRNA, ribosome plus tRNA together and create the first molecule, the first amino acid. Okay. Then the ribosome will shift one down because it has already read that one letter, that one piece of the mRNA, and will then read the next letter, letter 2. And will the ribosome will still be attached to the first amino acid, but it's reading the second letter, which a new tRNA, which is specifically bound to that amino acid that corresponds to that letter, will then be attached to the first amino acid. And it keeps doing this over and over and over, just shifting all the way down the mRNA until it reaches what's known as a stop codon, or some sort of stop signal. Stop codon is technically on the gene itself. And then you have this long polypeptide chain, this polyprotein chain that's just dangling outside of the ribosome, and it gets cut. And then the ribosome will dissociate from the mRNA. The mRNA will be degraded, and the ribosome will then go attached to another mRNA that's not associated to the previous polypeptide. So the polypeptide chain is then bound to by a number of proteins called chaperone proteins, or if you have ribosomes that are directly attached to what's a section of the cell called the endoplasmic reticulum, then they'll actually create the polypeptide chain inside of the endoplasmic reticulum, which will then have further processing that occurs. So the polypeptide chain is just, obviously, it's just a chain of amino acids. So we need more than that. We need it to actually be folded together into the actual correct protein that we want. So we have the structure, sure, but we need to actually fold it, or we have the components, but we need to actually fold it into the correct protein. Anyway, so where does the energy component come in here? Well, this whole process can occur, but there's processes or points where energy input is necessary. Energy input is specifically the ATP molecule. So you have to have sufficient ATP molecules to interact during all these steps. So the reason why I say that is, remember the tRNA that is bound to this amino acid and then gets attached to the ribosome? Well, for the amino acid to get attached to the tRNA, there's a transferase reaction that has to occur, which means that the amino acid and I think it's a aminotransferase reaction, something like that. There's a transfer reaction that has to occur where the amino acid, free-floating amino acid, is bound to the tRNA so that the tRNA can then go to the ribosome. For that reaction to occur, the combination of the tRNA to the amino acid, it is ATP driven. So you have to use a molecule of ATP to have that transfer occur. So there is a reaction. So every single amino acid that is attached to a tRNA has to have this ATP being consumed continuously. So now imagine how many proteins your cells have to create. I mean, just thousands and thousands and thousands of these proteins have to be created. For every single amino acid of that protein, which can be hundreds, you have to have at least one ATP molecule that's there to attach the very first step, this amino acid, to the tRNA. Think about that. That's a lot of energy. The second thing is a GTP molecule. So when the tRNA is then released from the ribosome, you have the consumption or the use of a GTP molecule. A GTP molecule is another form of cellular energy. It's not nearly as talked about as ATP. ATP is the main one, but GTP is also common, and GTP will then go through what's known as a hydrolysis process, where it goes from GTP to GDP, and so it essentially interacts with the tRNA that's bound to the ribosome, and once the ribosome has grabbed onto that amino acid, the tRNA then has to be kicked off as the ribosome moves on to the next section. And that whole process, a GTP has to be involved in that process and gets converted, or the energy is released from that molecule, which then allows the tRNA to be released. So there's two different elements where energy is used, and we're not even talking about all of them. These are just the ones that are kind of the common ones that we think of, but there are other processes along the way where, like, for example, the phosphorylation events, all the phosphorylation events where I'm talking about the tagging, let's say mTOR, right? If you're going to tag mTOR to be active, or if you're going to have mTOR tag some of the downstream proteins that it has an effect on, like the 4-EBP1, S6K, and all that stuff that I was talking about. The S6K itself is a kinase, which is an enzyme that actually uses ATP and uses phosphates from ATP and adds them to other proteins, other molecules. So all of those, every single one of those reactions requires ATP. It needs ATP present in high amounts of it to be able to have these effects occur downstream. So there is the reason why we need high levels of cellular energy for this whole protein synthesis process to occur. And that's not even talking about the processing and the putting together and the chaperoning and the transport and all that stuff. All of that requires energy. So that's the reason why we need to be eating enough to gain muscle. Okay, so what is enough? Well, there are not very many studies that actually look at exactly how much to consume to gain just the optimal amount. And what I mean by optimal amount is being able to gain enough. Is being able to gain muscle while minimizing the amount of fat gain that you gain. Now, barring steroids or any sort of like exogenous like hormone that you're going to be injecting or taking yourself, which definitely slants things strongly in favor of muscle growth and much less in fat growth, is, so we're talking about a natural person, a person who's not taking these things, typically based on the very limited research that's out there right now. And I go over a little bit more for the Physionic Insiders in one of my research reviews looking at two of these studies, but I would say being very conservative of 100 to about 300 calories, something like that, over your maintenance. That will allow you to be able to gain muscle, maybe not the fastest. You could probably gain muscle faster by consuming a little bit more, but the detriment is that you will be gaining more body fat. With 100 to 300 calories over maintenance, you'll be minimizing fat gain. You'll gain a little bit, but very little over time. But you'll be gaining muscle at a relatively rapid pace compared to where you could be. If you consume more, you could probably be gaining muscle a little bit faster, but you would also be gaining a large amount of fat as in combination. So that's where I stand on the topic. It took me a long time to figure all that stuff out. And there's still a few outstanding questions from when I was an undergrad that I'd like to dedicate some time to actually figure out what the answers are to that. Okay, wow. That was a lot of information. I know the niacin on heart disease part was a little bit all over the place, but now we're going to go over some comments from the subscribers, and then we're going to go into some housekeeping aspects. All right, so comments from subscribers. I just picked some random ones that I thought might be useful or might be interesting. So, I have maybe like 10 or 12 here. So first off, thank you for your comments. Like I said, I get thousands of them a day. So I can't really keep up with the number of comments that I get across all my videos. Because if I release a video, I usually try to stick around 24 hours, something like that, to, respond to as many comments as I can or at least read them and acknowledge them. But that's one video, and then I've got 300 other videos that are constantly accruing new comments. So it's just overwhelming. But I went through on some of the hot button topics and decided to cover some of the comments that I received. All right. So the first one is from Connie B17. So Connie's actually commented a few times. I definitely recognize the avatar or the picture on YouTube. So Connie said this is related to NMN. So the next 3 comments are related to NMN. Apologies for the lengthy comment. It's 2 topics in one. I'm actually not going to cover the second topic, mainly because it has to do with sponsorships for the channel, which I'll get into later. But I wanted to cover the actual part where she asks or talks about something actually helpful to everyone else. The other comment was helpful to me, which is very kind of Connie. I very much appreciate it. But, I imagine most people don't want to hear that because it doesn't help them. Okay, so apologies for the lengthy comment. It's 2 topics in one. We'll be covering one. Firstly, I'm taking NMN for one reason only, which is ovarian rejuvenation. There's a doctor on a channel called Modern Health Span who did a video on his wife's menopause reversal, and David Sinclair, who's one of the chief doctors that are researchers that's on NMN, also said the same happened to his sister, apparently. So it gave me some hope. I saw the info on the mouse studies where the old female mice started having babies again. I started NMN about a year ago, and I also went into menopause during that time. So I'm feeling really disheartened about it. Not to mention the cost, which is a nightmare. That's what I've heard. I'm reintroducing fasting, which helped previously, but I'm struggling to stay positive at this point. My last resort is PRP treatment, which I can't afford. So if you come across anything related to female fertility related and can shed some light on this topic in future videos, it'd be greatly appreciated. Thanks. Yeah, so a few things. So if I can go back to what I was talking about for NMN, one of the issues that I talked about is that we're just looking at blood markers when it comes to NMN research. Like, sure, there's animal research that goes into far more depth on for example, Connie mentioned it, looking at female mice started having babies again. Okay, so that's one thing. And that's certainly encouraging. The problem with the human data is that none of that has looked at those metrics. So it's not like I can sit here and be like, well, you're wasting your time with NMN because it will not be effective. It's like, I literally can't say that. It's the same reason that I was telling people before when they're saying NMN is super effective for all these different things. It's like, well, we don't actually know that because there's no research on epigenetic clocks or mitochondrial function or anything like that up to this point. So we can't say, and if it helps with menopause or ovarian rejuvenation, it's entirely possible. We don't know. We just simply don't know. So the only evidence that we have is in animal studies. So I don't want people to feel discouraged necessarily and think, well, that's it. The stake is in the heart. We just can't do anything related to NMN. That's not the case at all. Remember, science is limited to the metrics that it looks into. So, we look at the most common sense metrics, and then once we've beaten those to death, maybe we start looking at some of the deeper metrics. Like ovarian rejuvenation is one example. Looking at mitochondrial health, all that stuff. So, chin up. I hope that it does prove to be useful. You said that you've been taking it for about a year or so now. I don't know how it would translate with the mice. Let's say the mice research is exactly translatable, which it sometimes isn't, but let's just say, I wonder how long, because I wasn't able to look into this, but I wonder how long they were on NMN. So the reason why I say that is because let's say the mice live, let's say about 2 years. That would be a super old mouse, but let's say 2 years, and they start giving NMN to these mice at 1 year and 3 months old. And they were taking it for 3 months or something like that. That is not 3 months in human. If we were to translate that, that would be like several years of a human taking NMN. So, obviously I can't give you advice because I'm not your physician or anything, but I wouldn't necessarily despair based off of, I guess my point is I wouldn't despair based off of the evidence that's currently there. I wouldn't say, well then therefore NMN just doesn't have an effect. Try it. I mean, obviously you are, but try it for yourself and see. The other thing is that coming across anything on female fertility related topics, this is a major shortcoming of Physionic, to be completely honest with you. I recognize that a lot of the content is very general, and a lot of studies, unfortunately, are done in men, although there's a lot more studies now that are done in women as well, in combination or just in women. And I have been covering some of those studies in my study analyses. But I really hope that once Physionic grows to a large enough scale that I can dedicate more time to women's health, which is also a delicate topic because, well, I'm not a woman, and I wouldn't ever try to pretend to know what women go through. But I hope that once I get to that point where I have a large enough, it grows large enough that I can expand Physionic, that I'd be able to maybe interview women and get a sense of what's most important, and then maybe start dedicating more of my resources towards that. As a one-man operation, it's slow going. I get thousands of suggestions all the time. And it's just impossible for me to keep up with the workload. But, I do recognize, I guess my point being that I do recognize that one of the shortcomings of my work so far has been that none of it has been tailored specifically towards women. And it's something that I hope to address in the future. But if I did run across anything on female fertility, I will let you know. Although I don't know how to get in contact with you. I have your YouTube username, but beyond that, I don't have a way to get in contact with you. So please, maybe message me on Instagram or something like that, so that I do have a way to contact you. Or the Physionic community. That's a great place. I get a lot of comments and messages there too that I can't get to, but I will look out for Connie and see if I can, if anything were to ever pop up, that I send it to you. The next one is by Joseph Taylor 6285. So Joseph was saying, I'm wondering if any study, again, this is all related to NMN. I'm wondering if any study that includes diabetics or pre-diabetics is a fair study of any supplement. Diabetes inhibits uptake of a number of nutrients, if I'm not mistaken. So adding the extra burden of having to be a magic pill that overcomes a bad diet seems to be an unreasonable explanation. This is an excellent critique by Joseph. And you're absolutely right that diabetes does inhibit the uptake of nutrients. The most common is obviously sugar, or blood glucose, blood sugar. And it does seem unreasonable to think that if you were to take a supplement that suddenly all your woes would just disappear. For some people, sometimes they're so deficient in a particular nutrient or molecule in their body that it could restore those levels and it could have miraculous effects. But those are few and far between. So I would agree largely that I think the overall idea that if we take a supplement that it's suddenly going to change our entire life is probably unlikely. That said, there are instances, however, where taking a supplement could have a pretty tremendous effect. A great example of that is creatine. If you are sensitive to creatine, which there's a population that aren't, but if you're sensitive to creatine, you take creatine. After a few weeks and you start working out, or you've been working out and you start taking creatine, there are noticeable differences. I mean, it's a powerful effect where you're like, whoa, I could not lift that literally just a few days ago. And now I suddenly can, and really much easier than I did before. And then when you come off of creatine, you notice that your power and your strength and your ability to lift the weights for nearly as long isn't there. So there are instances, it's not just limited to creatine, of course. You can, like vitamin D is another one that people have talked about a lot. I need to do a lot more research on vitamin D, but people talk about vitamin D having these kind of tremendous effects. Obviously NMN, And I mean, we've even talked about, like, for example, niacin, if you take it in high enough doses that, which is always kind of an iffy thing because there are negatives that come with that. Like I was talking with flushing, diabetes, potential impact. The niacin can have some pretty tremendous effects on our blood markers. So, it depends, but as a whole, in general, yeah, I think that it's always best to focus on those foundational principles and to focus more on doing exercise, doing nutrition, all the stuff that's boring. People don't want to hear that. They just don't want to hear it. They want to hear, what stack of 1,000 supplements can I take that's going to turn around all of my health problems? And the answer is there's none. I mean, just straight up. The stack of supplements, what that's going to do for you is it's going to give you that added 20%. It's going to maybe fill some deficiencies or help in certain ways, but it's never going to be it's not ever going to be as powerful as doing the foundational things, the hard things, which are sticking to your nutrition, making sure that you're staying within a reasonable weight, and making sure that you're exercising in a number of different modalities. So, but speaking to NMN, there was that one study that did show improved benefit for pre-diabetic women, that they had better insulin sensitivity. The effect was mild, but it also just wasn't one measure. It was multiple measures. There was a physiological measure, and then there was more of like these cellular measures, like looking at mTOR, AKT, AS160, and like these different molecular measures, and they all showed an effect. So again, the effect was minor, definitely mild, but still, that does speak to me. Another critique of NMN is, like, a lot of the studies only show blood NMN levels increase. And that's a good critique, I think, because if you look at the tissue levels, it doesn't seem to increase usually. And that's fair, except we do still see effects. So I'm wondering if it just gets converted, or if the NAD just gets used up quickly. I don't know. I don't know what's going on with that. But what I do know is the actual functional effects seem to improve, again, but only in those specific instances. So I think that supplements can definitely have an effect. It's always just going to pale in comparison to doing all the major things, but those major things usually are difficult. They're not as easy as just popping a pill or taking a supplement. Even paying $100 a month, let's say, I don't know how much it is for an NMN supplementation. That's still easier than actually going running 3 times a week, or going biking, or lifting weights twice a week, or whatever it is. Like that's a real activation energy that you have to get over. So yeah, but to your overall point, Joseph, I agree. It sometimes does seem unreasonable to take a supplement and just expect it to just like, oh, that's going to fix all my problems. Very rarely. Sometimes it happens, but very rarely does that actually happen. Next one is from Catman4471, talking about an experience on NMN. So I'm 61 and I've been taking NMN for almost 4 years now and love it. My walking speed has increased. I have angina. For those unfamiliar, that's the kind of pain that radiates across the chest. So it can be usually a sign of heart disease. Angina, and don't need insosorbide mononitrate as often as I do without NMN. That's to deal with angina. My skin is amazing. I think there needs to be more adequate tests done using correct doses, age, and or longer periods of time. Having said that, NMN alone is no wonder drug, but one of several that should be taken in combination. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to there's many anecdotes of people having good experiences with NMN, a lot of anecdotes of people trying NMN and saying this had no effect on me. But so, that's why we have to rely on literature as a whole. But I think one of the key points that Catman brings up is that I think there needs to be more adequate tests done using correct doses, age, for longer periods of time. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I'm glad it's having such a positive effect for you. Um, I'm hoping that there will be studies that look at some of these other metrics and other populations, not necessarily looking at samples that are only in healthy individuals, but also looking at people that may be older, and looking at a variety of metrics as opposed to just looking at like lipoproteins and blood sugar and all that stuff. Okay, the next topic is methylene blue. I've got 2 comments on methylene blue. From Zarlodius1. I've been drinking it for 6 months. I only drink water and add 30 or so drops to every gallon-sized water bottle. I no longer get sore from the gym. My calorie burn jumped when taking it. I have not been sick since. The water bottle required cleaning once a week before, and now I never need to clean it. It has helped my elbow nerve issues significantly. I always have energy, and I'm turning 48 in November. Well, that's this month, so happy birthday. But physically feel like I am in my 20s. All right, first off, that's amazing. I'm really thrilled to hear it, regardless of what the reason is. That's really fantastic to see people improving their health and feeling better about it. The other thing is, so you mentioned that your water bottle required cleaning once a week before, and now I never need to clean it. Well, one of the reasons for that is, I didn't mention this, but methylene blue is also effective against bacteria. Probably not all bacteria, but at least some bacteria. So that may be a reason. And it's also, I think, been investigated as an antiviral. It's kind of this multifaceted molecule. It's a really cool molecule, but I haven't looked into those specifics. So I don't know how much credence there is behind it. This is all based off that scientific review that I read. All right. So yeah, that's great. I do sometimes wonder when people comment, though. I no longer get sore at the gym. Okay, you can probably tell that. But the problem is, like, if you start going to the gym, or even if you've been at the gym for a while and you switch up machines, you're going to get sore from that. But then as you stick to that for a while, you become less and less sore. So I wonder if that's just associative. I don't know. I don't want to, I mean, you would know better than I would, Zarlodius. And the calorie burn jumped up when taking it. That is something that I'm always a little trepidatious when people tell me they've, these different claims, because that would actually take tests. You can't just measure it very easily. You'd have to go to an institution, some sort of health center, and actually get a test done, if that's a BMR test, before and after. So, it's like those kinds of things. I'm always like, okay, all right. But I mean, it may feel that way, but is that actually the case? We'd have to actually test that. So you'd have to do a before test for like a bod pod test, or, I'm sorry, not a bod pod, to look at indirect calorimetry or direct calorimetry in a chamber for direct calorimetry, or using a oxygen CO2 test, a metabolic cart test, for the indirect calorimetry method. So we'll see. But regardless, I mean, who cares? If you feel much better, that's really wonderful. That's amazing. The next question is from Nuance Matters. Nuance Matters. I like that. Well, I mean, you know why, if you've been with Physionic for some time. I only learned of the existence of methylene blue a couple weeks ago through some channel called Nootropics or something like that. Anyway, in the comment section, the guy who posted the video answered someone's question. The person had asked if there are any other supplements that should not be taken while taking meth blue. Don't take meth, kids. Methylene blue. He said CoQ10 should be avoided, and another couple, which I do not remember. Do you know why this may be? So why not to take CoQ10 while you're taking methylene blue? So I don't know, obviously I don't know what this person was thinking, but my interpretation is that CoQ10 is involved in the electron transport chain. And it happens at it's involved in one of the sections that's skipped by methylene blue. So taking CoQ10, if it were to reach the mitochondria and we were to look at it from a mitochondrial standpoint, it would probably be a moot point because methylene blue skips over that section of the electron transport chain and affects complex 4. So in that situation, it'd be a redundant system. And it would be pointless to be spending your money on CoQ10. Now, I actually just covered a little bit on CoQ10 with the Physionic Insiders, and there are other benefits of CoQ10, which I will be making content on publicly as well, to look at CoQ10's effects on like skin aging and probably some other areas as well. But my understanding, like the way that I would interpret it, is that would probably be the reason why a person may not want to take CoQ10. All right, the next area is eating to gain muscle. So I wanted to get real tactical here and offer some real benefits. So the first question is the Halo Kidster 7102 is the first comment, I should say. So first, the Halo Kidster, hopefully you do play Halo. I have been a massive fan of the game Halo for many years, many years. If you'd ask any of my friends, they would tell you that I was obsessed with that game. I still play whenever I have a free moment in my life, which I try to force myself to have once a week. So during that time, I like to play with a group of friends. Anyway, so the Halo Kidster was asking, which is your favorite Halo game? They weren't asking this by the way, but if you're listening, what's your favorite Halo game? I have this debate with one of my friends from time to time. I'm still very much a Halo 2 massive fan. I mean, they're all, well, I shouldn't say they're all fantastic. One of them is not that great, but the others are really fantastic. But the first three were really incredible. And multiplayer wise, the Halo 6 Infinite has been a lot of fun, but now that they've fixed things. But anyway, I digress. You don't want to hear this if you're listening to the podcast. The Halo Kidster said, this is the actual question. Would have been nice to know your thoughts on eating at maintenance or slightly below with a higher body fat percentage. Obviously, whilst meeting protein requirements, a recomp, if you will. Yeah, so the answer to this is that it is possible to gain muscle if you are overweight and you are reducing your body fat. So that means that you are actually under-consuming from a nutritional standpoint. You're under-consuming, but the idea here is that you have so much excess body fat on your body that you are still supplying sufficient energy amounts from your body fat to the musculature for this whole ATP and GTP cycle to occur that I was talking about. And there's good evidence that if you are overweight, you can gain muscle while being in a calorie deficit. Up to a point. There's a point where eventually you get to a point where you're lean enough that is no longer the reality, and you actually don't gain muscle nearly as quickly, if at all, while you're losing body fat. So if you're overweight, the answer is yes. And of course, maintaining protein and all that stuff. The next question is, Lord of the Fallen. Personally, I think 100 calorie surplus is difficult to suggest because it's easy to say your maintenance is 2,000 calories. But even that can change from day to day. So you go from a surplus to maintenance to even under eating real quick. Yeah, that's fair. That's true. I think generally, getting so focused in on the different changes day to day is not a productive way to look at like applying this information. So I'll speak for myself. The last 15 years. Yeah, last 15 or so years, I have just hit a target, just hit that target every single day. I just don't worry about like, oh, I went for a walk that was 3 miles long, so therefore I burned this amount of calories. I just ignore all that stuff. I just keep hitting that target. That day I may have underconsumed. The other day I may have overconsumed a little bit, but it's just like trying to hit that target every single time. It averages out to 100 calorie surplus. Some days maybe you won't recover as well. Some days you might recover a little bit better. And if you want to aim for something a little bit higher, like 300, again, that's why I gave that range of 100 to 300. 300 is a good number because you're definitely making sure that you're probably in that surplus. And then you're mitigating some of the problems that you're mentioning, because, a 300 calorie swing, that means that maybe you go down to maintenance for a 300 calorie swing. You need a 600 calorie swing to get into a loss for the day. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you want to hit for a little bit higher, that's perfectly fine. Okay, the next one is Calm Your Mind 5665. If a person is carrying around excess fat and they start eating at maintenance or less while resistance training, would energy from fat cells go toward protein synthesis? In other words, if you are overweight, can you gain muscle and lose fat at the same time? So it's similar to the Halo Kidster question, but I didn't plan on answering specifically the body fat part. So yeah, the answer is yes. It is possible. I guess I'll add some nuance here too, or add more information. So when you're removing body fat, your body fat is essentially releasing triglycerides into the bloodstream, and those end up at the musculature. The musculature then takes those triglycerides up and then it takes up the fatty acids. So the fatty acids then, which are a component of the triglycerides, then get oxidized. So that's a process of oxidation that I was talking about earlier, that there's benefits to oxidation as well. But this type of oxidation is to cut up the fat molecule and use that for energy within the mitochondria. So the answer is yes. You could, if you are fat enough, if you have enough fat on your body, that you are releasing enough of these fat molecules that you can still feed this entire system. There's a point though where you don't have nearly as much fat. So while you're still releasing fat molecules into the system, you're also endangering your muscle, your lean tissue, not just your muscle, but your lean tissue as a whole. So the body's constantly adjusting. And at one point when you have really high surplus, it can constantly take from that surplus, but eventually you get to a point where it starts to plateau outwards, which is what I was alluding to earlier with the Halo Kidster. So the answer is yes. Now, the other areas where you can gain muscle and lose fat is when you're a complete beginner. Typically, that's actually not from the release of fat from the bloodstream, or from the fat cells, excuse me. But it's actually more so because the muscle cells are so primed or ready to grow that they can take up a lot more of these nutrients, and you're seeing this a lot of growth signaling from like the muscle damage, which is going to be really high when you first start out, as well as some of these mechanical signals. So you'll see increases in muscle growth that are really substantial when you're a complete beginner. And that is far less coupled to the amount of body fat that you have on your body. But you're also going to be going through like a recomp in that situation as well. So similar question, but overall the answer is yes. Yeah. If you're already relatively lean, I'm not talking like bodybuilder or fitness model or anything like that, but let's say like as a man, if you're like 20% body fat or 15% body fat, it's going to be a lot harder. But once you get higher in those body fat percentages, and certainly for women, once you get into like, men and women in 30s and 40s of percent body fat, then really like focusing a lot more on just protein intake and making sure that you're under consuming, you're going to see drops in body fat, and you are going to see rises in muscle mass up until that inflection point, which is tough to predict. All right, the last question is, before we get into some of the housekeeping things, is I'm not gaining weight, which is from Morphless. Yeah, Morphless. I'm not gaining weight sufficient is not gaining weight sufficient indicator that one is not overeating. And then they go on to describe, I think I eat quite a bit and also train, so resistance train, but not too much. But most important thing is that even though I eat quite a lot, say 700 calories for breakfast alone, and then 2.5 to 3 meals a day, but I always stay almost the same weight. So 64 kilograms plus 2 for like 5 or more years. The device measuring my body fat in the gym, that's put my body fat at less than 10%. Yet mild hypochondria is fun. Okay, good joke. But I always look at all kind of poop that's wrong with me. But sensibly, if no weight is gained, I likely am not over consuming, ? So I guess the big overall arch is, if you're not gaining weight, is that a sufficient indicator that you're not overeating? The answer is yes. You could get into a little bit more specifics looking at like different. No, I think the answer is yes. I would say that's the strongest indicator that you're not overeating. But in terms of muscle mass, what I always tell people, I used to coach people when it came to muscle growth and body composition and stuff like that. And what I would always tell people is if you're not gaining weight on the scale, then you're probably not gaining muscle. And clearly I just went over exceptions to that rule, but it's important to simplify things initially and then get into more of the complexities. As a person kind of gets bored of the same rule over and over, then they might start asking more questions. Well, what about this? What about this? And then you can get into more of those complexities. But as it stands, the overall rule is if you're not gaining weight, and what I mean by gaining weight, I'm not talking about like 5 pounds a month. I'm talking about maybe a pound a month, maybe half a pound a month. That would be the ideal. So where you're gaining a lot of muscle, a little bit of body fat, because that's just unavoidable, and trying to, optimize that whole process. So yes, you typically want to be gaining weight for you to actually have this benefit of muscle growth. Now, you can body recomp, which is a recomposition where you lower body fat and you increase muscle mass. There's a little bit of evidence on that, but the evidence is sparse, and it's also in people that are training really hard as well as eating a large amount of protein. So they're really focusing a lot on protein. And in that situation, they're maintaining their weight, but they're reducing their body fat and they're increasing their musculature. But the process is also very slow. So it's not optimal in terms of going in any one direction. That's why typically coaches recommend you should stick to either dropping body fat or gaining muscle. Choose one. And you usually want to stick to those for months, especially when it comes to gaining muscle. You want to be gaining muscle for at the very least 3 months, but I would say probably more like 6 months and beyond. So, that's how I would answer that. It is a sufficient indicator though that you're not overeating. All right. The final topics is to do a little bit of housekeeping here. So I wanted to discuss this sponsorship video that I had released. This was several weeks back, maybe a month or a month and a half ago. I talked about sponsorships. So I built the Physionic Insiders last year, maybe a little bit over a year ago now. And I've been focusing a lot of my efforts at making the content as high quality as I can possibly make it. That said, the reason why I had to do that, or one of the reasons why I had to do that, is because I've been really resistant to the idea of taking on sponsorships to make money. I realize that a lot of people don't I think a lot of people don't realize that it takes a lot of money to pay for what I'm doing. I spend well over $1,000 a month just to release free content. So the only way I'm able to pay for that is through, because I can't pay for it as on my student stipend. I mean, that there's no way I would, yeah, there's just absolutely no way. So what I've been doing is I've been using my Physionic Insiders, the amount of money that I make from the Physionic Insiders, and I've been putting that back into Physionic, which I explained in the video. Now, that said, I also understood that at one point, the price point for the Physionic Insiders was relatively high, and I understood that that wasn't necessarily feasible for everyone. So I just recently I created a tier that was lower tier for people that wanted to have access to a lot of the information that was part of the Physionic Insiders, so that I could, have it be more accessible to people while also still keeping the insiders alive, so that I can keep the public content for Physionic alive. So that said, I was also considering sponsorships. So, where, a company would sponsor to have a segment in the video and then go from there. Because I've been contacted by hundreds and hundreds of sponsorship opportunities, which I actually misspoke. In that video, I said one of the sponsorship opportunities was from Macro Factor. That is incorrect. The answer is Factor, which is the food delivery service, which is part of the HelloFresh and whatnot. Macro Factor is, I got it confused because Macro Factor is another company. I actually know one of the owners of Macro Factor. He reached out to me, and I had to apologize to him. He wasn't mad or anything like that. He's a really kind person, just we had a great conversation about sponsorships and just like how to navigate them and all that. But he was also like, "Did we reach out to you about that?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I completely messed that up." So my apologies. I posted a correction under the video, but I wanted to acknowledge it here as well. So it wasn't Macro Factor, it was Factor. But anyway, so yeah, so I've been getting contacted by these sponsorships, and I mean, you can make a lot of money from sponsorships, but on the other hand, I also just don't want to be in this position where I am seen as biased, where I am seen as this person that's just chasing like a company has some control over what I say and how I say it and all this stuff. And so I've been really reticent to the idea of having sponsorships. And I asked for people's opinions, and I mean, so many people, hundreds of comments from people. I was so blown away by the kindness and the opinions that people offered, which of course I was asking for. But most, like 95% of people said they were okay, they were good with sponsorships. But then like within that, there was some level of, okay, so sponsorships, sure, but should it be unaffiliated, like I don't know, some VPN, or should it be some other? Should it be like cosmetics or just anything that's not related to the topic that I'm talking about, or should it be related and be an actual benefit to people? And that's another thing I was wrestling around with, and I still don't really know the answer to that. I don't really like the idea of just randomly. I like to do a great job at everything that I do, and even when it comes to a sponsorship, I feel like I realize people don't like companies and whatnot, but companies do serve a purpose sometimes. Like Physionic is also a business. I mean, so at a certain point, if Physionic grows to a point where I hope that it does one day, people are going to hate it as well, because they think it's a big entity that is trying to make money. I mean, that's the case for every company. So anyway, I'm not going to get into it, but there's always this like back and forth of, should you stay completely independent or should you get the involvement of some companies that can sponsor you? And when it comes to sponsorships, I think to myself, like, I would want to make it fun. I just don't want to be creating content. I don't want to be creating these like videos where it's like, okay, now let's talk about ABC company. And then it's just this script reading. ABC company does a really good job with, and I like them because it's just like everybody skips that. Everybody always skips that. And I like to have fun. I very much enjoy my script writing process, the notes that I take for my videos so that I'm well organized when I'm thinking about it. Clearly not for this podcast, but for the rest of it. And so I would always want to put my best foot forward with a sponsorship as well. And I find that really difficult to do if I'm talking about like diabetes risk and then suddenly switch gears to, okay, guys, let's talk about ABC company that sells telecommunication devices. It's like, what? I mean, I know exactly what would happen. There'd be a huge dip in the analytics as people skip to the rest of the content. So I feel like creating sponsorships with companies that are actually related to the topic is the better way to go, and actually making it interesting and making it something that people would want to watch. However, the problem with that, of course, is then it's related to the topic. So then you don't know if my bias is the reason why I'm promoting this company or having a sponsorship with this company. So it's a difficult situation. I ended up deciding for the time being not to do sponsorships. It dramatically kills my income. But I can still, Physionic is still doing just fine without it. And I'd like to just continue building the business side by making, for example, the Physionic Insiders more approachable. I can't make it like $1 or anything like that, just because the amount of work that I put into it is so much. It's so much. So I did lower the price for one of the tiers, and I talked about that in the follow-up video. And I'd hoped that would help, and it did help. A lot of people joined, which I'm incredibly thankful. And I've gotten a lot of messages from people that said like, wow, I've been getting so much benefit from the insiders, which makes me so thrilled, because I think about what kind of public content and what kind of insider content I can release to be the biggest like punch that it can be. And there's so many considerations behind the scenes that I can't get into. It's just, like video length, the editing process, how I want to design something. It's just, there's so much that goes into it. And I'm constantly reading my analytics and trying to get better. So it's like I'm dealing with my PhD. I'm dealing with content creation, but content creation is such a tiny sliver of what it actually is. It's, research of sometimes 20 studies that I have to read from front to back, which takes weeks and weeks of time, and all this stuff while writing my dissertation, all that good stuff. So there's a lot going on, and marketing, and wow, it's just a lot. So yeah, I decided to not do sponsorships for the time being, but in the future, I may end up doing some. I just like to do them tastefully, and I'd like to do a great job at them, and hopefully provide something that people would actually get a benefit from, as opposed to me just talking some nonsense about some company that I just don't really care about. Not that I'll ever be wildly in favor of any one company or anything, but mainly because the only thing I'm wildly excited about is Physionic, because I have total control over it. So that's the one thing that I feel strongly has good ethics behind it and all that. So anyway, I don't want to rehash the whole video. If you're interested, you can check it out, but it's on the channel. It says like, I'd like your opinion on something like that. And you can check it out. But I want to say thank you for all the input I appreciate all the people that join the Insiders. It certainly helps. And I will continue to be releasing high quality content for the Insiders, of course, publicly as well. I mean, that's always one of my priorities. It's just with the flood of comments that I get, questions left and right, I really have to focus in on this smaller group of people that I've promised that I would give like this extra attention towards. So yeah, if you're one of the Insiders, thank you. And I'm always thrilled to talk with you. We have some great conversations in there, especially in the live sessions. I really enjoyed those for the higher tier. And yeah, that's kind of the direction I'm leaning for the time being. And we'll see about the future. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is, so my PhD progress. Every time I do one of these podcasts, or the last few times, I've been talking about my PhD progress. I think last time I mentioned that I'm kind of in the home stretch, which I briefly mentioned it. I'm actually writing my dissertation now, which is it's, well, I wouldn't call it fun, but it's nice to be finally getting into that home stretch, like really making it, like solidifying this is the home stretch. So that's really great. The other aspect, another requirement for my program is that I release a first author paper. So we are actually in the process of submitting my first author paper that I've been working on over the last few years. So that's going to be submitted pretty soon. So I'm really excited about that. I probably won't hear back if it gets accepted or not until probably like January, I would guess. January or February, I'm assuming. So it'll be a while because of the holidays and all that good stuff. But that's another step. It's another step to the end, and not the end of, not in such dramatic fashion, but it's coming to an end, which I'm thankful because a PhD really wears on you. I've learned just an incredible amount of info. I've never learned this amount of information, except for maybe when I was 3 years old and I was learning how to walk and talk and all that good stuff. Maybe then I was learning at this kind of rate, but this is the last several years. It's mind-boggling how much I've learned. And a lot of it has to do with Physionic as well. So yeah, I always try to end these on a more positive note. I realize that this podcast is now 3-4 hours long. And I did mention that these podcasts were going to be these really extended versions of everything. And I hope that you get benefit from it. I really do. I enjoy doing it. I realize that some people just want straight information just as quickly as possible. But I do that with everything else. I do that with all my other content. I would like a place that I can just talk and let my nerdiness flow out from me. Good. Like the, was it Emperor Palpatine? Is that his name? Emperor Palpatine? Let the hate flow through you, Luke. Or Anakin. Did you say it? I don't know. Whatever. Star Wars nerds. I'm sure you can correct me. I'm not as big a fan of Star Wars as I am of Halo, which luckily I didn't say Star Trek, because that would be a real problem. Okay, which I do enjoy Star Trek a lot as well, except for the new films. Those are, ugh, no, the old stuff. Anyway, I think I'll leave it here. I hope that this was a benefit to you. And if you're not a fan of me kind of going off the rails every once in a while, then I don't know. I mean, it's just the way I like to do things when it comes to the podcast. Being too formal with things all the time is just it's not fun. It's not human. It's just not human. It's not being true to who we are as human beings, fallible as we are. And and hopefully now that the episode is 3-4 hours long, people that were listening to me to fall asleep are able to, well, I mean, they're if they're getting 7-8 hours of sleep, then they just put this on repeat twice, then done. You got like, thanks, Nick. Clearly, I just helped you fall asleep and stay asleep and get a good night's sleep. So congratulations. This podcast is a health benefit for that reason alone. Okay. All right. Well, it was great chatting with you, and till next time, and have a great rest of your year. I'm assuming the next podcast will probably be with me alone, is going to be next year. But yeah, I'm always thankful for the Physionic community, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.